The night, like a velvet cloth, covered the imperial chambers, where two lovers intertwined in a passionate dance. The man, bare-chested, stood before Eliza. His eyes sparkled with excitement. She was probably trembling with fear, surprised by her silent silence. Only a heavy sigh escaped her chest, and she, as if in a whirlpool, plunged into his strong embrace and passionate kisses. When Elizabeth first appeared before the emperor, she announced that she was carrying Regent Christian's child. She brought the emperor a false story, woven out of desperation for salvation, and she assured him that she would give birth to an heir for the duke. And Christian gave her one last chance. The man promised that they would use each other by mutual consent. Their marriage, sealed by contract, was only a shadow of a true union. Waking up, Her Highness saw him sleeping peacefully, and the silence of the chambers was not broken by any news of her special condition. The terms of their agreement remained unfulfilled. Her hand, as if caressing memories, gently touched his black hair. The woman thanked him for everything that had brought them together. Elizabeth mentally expressed her sincere hope that Christian would gain freedom and forget about her, and she lightly touched his forehead with her lips. She felt the only regret that she had never been able to understand her own feelings. She had never understood whether true love burned in her heart. Dressing in the silence of the morning twilight, Her Highness left the chambers, leaving him in his own sleep. The next day, the shocking news of Her Highness's pregnancy swept through the palace. The man clutched the report in his hand. He mentioned their marriage, sealed by a contract that was just a formality, and that she was free to leave him at any time. His Highness was surprised how she could dare to leave, carrying his child under her heart, and he ordered to immediately surround all the possessions. Knowing her fragile health, which did not allow her to escape far, he ordered Elizabeth Isaac to be found in a cold voice. Realizing that no matter how hard she tried to escape fate, her place was always next to him with regret. 7 centuries ago, the dragon's fury swept across the continent like a fiery tornado. 5 wizards, former students of the fire-breathing dragon, betrayed their mentor. They stood up for humanity. The knowledge they gained from the dragon allowed them to later independently resist its power. A country founded by wizards who saved people and tamed a dragon. It was awash with fame and respect across the continent. The empire of the sacred morning Argan. However, its greatness was ruthlessly trampled by the hooves of the barbarian kingdom. Like a black cloud, it rushed from the north. They destroyed everything in their path, and the noble princess of the great empire, Elizabeth Isaac, was ordered to be captured. As she fled, she felt the end inexorably approaching, and the whirlpool of fate was about to ensnare her in its webs. The Bonnell camp shook with cries. The soldiers scattered like wasps, shouting that the woman of Argan had killed Sir Rodericket, ordering him to find her. The girl, dazed and covered in blood, did not know where to run. Finally, the only refuge she could find was an enemy military camp. A few hours ago, Sir had pinned her against the wall, trying to find out how she had dared to infiltrate the enemy camp of Bonnell without any fear in her eyes. He immediately realized that she was a refugee from Argan. Her snow-white hair clearly indicated this. He was consumed by curiosity. Was the beautiful runaway princess from Argan the same as the girl he was trying to keep? The princess tried to release the magic, and one of the carved circles on her body flashed with a strange glow. Opening her eyes, she saw that she was covered in blood. She couldn't understand what had happened. The man lay motionless. Life had left his body. She hadn't even touched the magic circle. Elizabeth watched an enemy warrior die before her eyes. If she were caught, escape would be impossible. Then she decided to end her life. Trembling, she touched the magic circle on her left foot. Her heart beat wildly like a caged bird ready to break free. The princess remembered her brother's words, which echoed in her mind about the magic circles tattooed on her body. They served as the key to simple defensive and offensive spells. Touch them and whisper their name, and the circle would awaken its power. The tattoo on her left ankle was to be used only in times of greatest need. But the girl, bathed in tears, begged Andrew not to leave her. He urged her on, assuring her that it was better to live as a slave than to die. She clung to him, choking on sobs. Frightened and confused, Elizabeth begged to go with him, for her magical power was but a spark against his flame. Andrew emphasized his imperial status and duty to protect the palace. With a wave of his hand, he created a large magical sphere around his sister. His words rang in the air, about her survival, which would mean disobeying Argan. The girl tried in vain to call her brother from the shimmering sphere. He begged his sister to survive at all costs, and then to come and build him a grave. With a heavy heart, he let Elizabeth go into obscurity. The princess, fighting panic, realized the burden that had fallen on her shoulders. She was the sole heir to the throne of Argan, the last of the imperial family. Her survival was not just a personal desire, but a sacred duty to her brother's memory. She needed to escape the trap and find refuge in Regal, Argan's loyal ally, where Elizabeth hoped to find support and help. From outside the tent came the anxious voices of the knights searching for the Archduke. The questions of whether he was inside pierced the silence, making her flinch. The feeling that someone was there made her heart ache. Suddenly a man entered the tent, eager to know what the commotion was about. Everyone around was shouting, accusing the woman of Argan of killing Sir Roderick. The princess froze, suddenly recognizing Archduke Christian. 3 years ago, the imperial palace of Argan was ablaze with lights. A magnificent celebration was taking place there in honor of Emperor Andrei Isaac. All the nobility gathered for the celebration. Andrei, not leaving his sister, showed great concern. He persistently suggested that she rest in her chambers. The princess, not hiding her irritation, refused. She complained about the rumors that were spreading because of his excessive care. Elizabeth was furious with the gossip. Their relationship, like twin brother and sister, caused unnecessary talk. Suddenly her gaze fell on another figure. Her brother followed her attention. That she was watching Regent Christian, captain of the Knights of Benella. He was the emperor's half-brother, but not by blood. It was whispered that his mother was a concubine, fathering him to an unknown man. But when the current emperor ascended the throne, Regent, thanks to his exploits, received the title of Archduke. His obscure origin has always been the subject of gossip. Seeking to prove his strength, he did not shy away from bloody battles. For this reason, he was nicknamed the God of War or the Emperor's Watchdog. It was obvious that he had no desire to have anything to do with their kingdom. If he saw her at a banquet, he would immediately recognize her as Princess Argana. Excited voices were heard again from outside. They were reporting an urgent report for the Archduke. The girl felt her hope shattered, and she realized that soon she would join her brother. For some reason, he ordered her to escape. Suddenly, the Archduke knelt down to greet Her Highness, Princess Argana. Apologizing for the awkward situation, he invited her to sit on the bed. Embarrassed by her blood-stained clothes, he asked permission to touch her. The girl could not understand his intentions, but later she guessed that he wanted to help, thinking she was injured. Christian apologized and carefully wiped her shoulders and arms with a napkin. The princess was surprised by this attitude. It was not at all like the attitude towards an enemy, and a faint hope for salvation arose in her heart. The man continued to wipe her, and their eyes met. When he finished, Elizabeth thanked him quietly. The Archduke called Sir Reuben. The knight entering asked what he was doing, and noticing the woman, he froze in surprise. He knew that she had killed Sir Roderick. The man strictly ordered that respect be shown to Her Highness the Princess. The knight was stunned by the princess. Christian reminded her that she was the last of the imperial family, and on her last journey, due respect should be shown. The guards, like stone statues, stood by the tent. Elizabeth, dressed in clean clothes, slowly ate the food brought to her, pondering Christian's words, how he spoke of respect for her final journey. It was hard for her to eat after such words. He could have killed her right away without further ado. The knights near the tent whispered quietly, discussing the princess the emperor was hiding, and about her closeness to the imperial family. One of them reported that the Archduke had sent a pigeon to the emperor for further orders, and a reply was expected shortly. He warned his comrade to watch his words and emphasized respect for members of the imperial family. He was indignant, recalling the fall of the empire, the death of the emperor, and the destruction of Argon. But at the same time, he warned against underestimating. The man remembered the myths about Argon. The comrade certainly knew about the wizards who protected the continent from the dragon. The girl remembered her brother Andri, the only family, and the steel shield that was no longer there. His last words became her testament. She survived alone, and there was no time for tears. She needed to pull herself together and find out about Bunel. Maybe someone would save her life. The men, tired from their guard duty, continued their conversation. One of them remarked that they would be back soon. Another replied that His Majesty had always been meticulous about the Archduke. He wished him to have a healthy heir. His companion asked in surprise if the bloodline had really died out. After all, the Archduke was an unusual person. Was there ever a woman capable of giving birth to a half-dragon? The princess had heard words about half-dragons, creatures described in the books she had read. Creatures young, elusive, inhuman. They had weak intelligence, poor social skills, and an inability to control the dragon madness that flowed through their veins. And they had an ugly appearance. She understood everything. So Regret Christian was half-dragon. 5 days later, the princess was still in the tent at the camp. Christiana and her assistant visited her. They brought her a tray of suicide items. Elizabeth wondered if the princess of a fallen empire deserved such honors. The Archduke announced a letter from His Majesty the Emperor. The princess pondered that she would be brought to the capital of Benella and publicly beheaded. She was silent, considering the situation. Choosing death was respect. The most luxurious death for a member of the defeated imperial family. By choosing death, Elizabeth saved face in the face of the enemy. But how can one survive while preserving one's honor? Christian, bowing his head, repeated the emperor's message. The strongest and most influential man in the camp and the state. He was to leave an heir. The princess, with dignity that did not fade even in the face of the inevitable, asked, what would happen if she refused the death imposed on her? Christian, bowing his head in submission, replied that he would carry out His Majesty's order. He would personally deliver her to Benella, unharmed and alive. Elizabeth hesitantly picked up the knife and examined its blade carefully. She could only hope for the integrity of the letter's author. The girl announced her intention not to commit suicide, and insisted that she be taken to the capital of Benella alive. And with these words she plunged the knife into her chest. Christian turned pale and picked up her exhausted body. The girl quietly asked to be taken alive. Darkness had consumed her consciousness. Whatever suffering she had to endure, she would survive. The last drop of the greatness of the extinct dynasty pulsed in her veins. Elizabeth lay on the bed, pale and unconscious, lost in a silent sleep. The Archduke sat beside her like a stone statue. His gaze wandered over her calm face, her thoughts churning like a raging sea. Every time she tried to escape, her body was covered in wounds. Did the princess really want death? Her actions seemed like a clever dance, the goal of which was to win Christian over to her side. No one could have imagined that she would use the imperial order as an unbreakable shield, demanding unharmed delivery to the capital. A sudden insight struck him like lightning. Now he understood why the emperor had guarded her so carefully from prying eyes. Her beauty, shining even through the veil of unconsciousness, was a dangerous weapon, capable of clouding anyone's mind. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the princess's voice. She turned to the Archduke, asking if he wanted to tell her something. His surprise knew no bounds when she opened her eyes. The weak but determined girl asked if he really hadn't noticed that she wasn't sleeping. To Elizabeth, it seemed as if he was deliberately avoiding conversation. Her fingers touched the wound and she whispered, perhaps only new blood would make him speak. Christian sighed heavily, lowered his head and closed his eyes. In his opinion, Her Highness should know how to protect herself, and he carefully took her delicate hand. But the girl, lowering her gaze, indifferently moved away. She knew that upon arrival at Benella, death awaited her, and she did not allow him to touch her. Elizabeth suddenly seized his large, courageous hand. With a serious expression on her face, she asked if Sir Christian was married. Her question came like a bolt from the blue, startling him. He replied that he was single, and she seemed convinced that many would dream of becoming his wife. The question of why he was still not married haunted her. The Archduke did not know if she knew about the terrible rumors, and he could not imagine that any father would dare to give his daughter in marriage to a man who was considered a monster. The princess knew that he was an unusual creature, half-dragon, in whose veins pulsed the blood of an ancient dragon. And what's more, he was not human. The creature found it difficult to contain its nature, for the madness of a dragon raged within its soul. Only periodic killings could quell its inner beast. A cursed race, doomed to eternal torment. Elizabeth assured that rumors are often far from the truth, and she had heard that Emperor Benella dreamed of an heir. Christian assured me that he didn't have such a strange hobby, to kill a woman for the sake of the illusory hope of an heir, and he had no desire to see blood at all. He noticed how her fingers, which were gripping his hand, suddenly trembled. The man was surprised why the girl, seized with fear, did not let go of his hand. The princess knew that for an ordinary woman this would be fatal. She claimed that in the Argan family the power of sorcerers was passed down from the ancestor. After all, the power of sorcerers flowed in the veins of the ancestor Argan and his descendants. Hearing this, the man was surprised and asked if she was a sorceress. The princess answered mysteriously, and told about the numerous myths about dragons that circulated in the imperial family. In his mind, like a flash of lightning, a connection emerged between disparate facts. Dragons, half-dragons, and this woman, who seemed to be involved with him. Christian watched the princess, trying to guess her intentions. Was she really hoping to arouse his pity? But why, when she was already promised a dignified death that befitted her noble lineage? Why did she choose such a difficult path? So he coldly replied to the princess that he had no intention of helping her, and added in a stern tone that she should not even think about any senseless actions. The girl did not give up. Her voice echoed through the cold walls of the tent, trying to pierce the Archduke's armor. She was ready for anything, even to fall on his knees begging for mercy. But he only coldly denied it, asking her not to say absurd things, not to humiliate herself. Her eyes filled with tears, she pleaded. Elizabeth hoped to awaken in the Archduke at least a drop of sympathy, but he replied that her tears only made him feel more sorry than he already felt. She could not understand his indifference to her suffering. He did not allow her to bend her knees without giving her a single crumb of hope. The princess's despair reached its limit. What could be done to move his heart of stone? So she asked him to stay by her side, not to leave the tent for a moment. He bowed his head and agreed, if that was her order. Elizabeth apologized for disturbing him, and holding his hand tightly, she quietly warned him. He himself said that her life could end at any moment. The Archduke raised his eyebrows in surprise, and she tenderly kissed his hand, hinting that it was the least he could do for her. The late night had fallen silent over the camp. Only the footsteps of the guard cut through the darkness, guarding her tent. The princess dozed peacefully. Christian, sitting on a stool next to her, also fell asleep. Dreams intertwined with reality, and she saw her brother. He stood before her as kind and close as ever. Elizabeth felt sorry. If she had become empress, she would have died and he would have survived. A brother with determination and strength would have been able to save Argan from falling. After all, he was one of those who always achieved his goal, never knowing defeat. Andrei assured her that without her he was nothing. His existence had no meaning. Therefore he begged her to listen to him, to hear his words as if they were his last. He insisted that she was far more amazing and powerful than she had imagined, that she was the Princess of Argan, worthy of universal respect and honor. But the girl only protested bitterly, lowering her gaze. If her brother knew what plan she was hatching, he would despise her for the rest of his days. Elizabeth promised that she would definitely take care of his tombstone. She would make it majestic and worthy of his memory, and then she would leave. The Archduke woke up from her delirium. He had heard about her illness, but he didn't think it was really true. The girl was cold and delirious. Every emotion had its own basis, its own reason, even if it was hidden in the depths of the subconscious. Despite the fact that he had only seen the princess once. 3 years ago, her image had been etched in his memory like a precious fragment of memories. The princess was an unattainable treasure for him, a precious stone that the Archduke dared not touch, a woman who shone so brightly like the sun incarnate. Christian felt that his time was irretrievably lost, that his opportunities were squandered. So he rose from his chair and approached her silently. Touching her face, the man felt her body burn with heat. Then, carefully and gently, he placed his hand on her shoulder. Elizabeth's eyes suddenly opened and her gaze was sharp. She asserted as if pronouncing a sentence that he did not understand her. Christian shuddered, thinking she had woken up because of his presence. The girl grabbed him tightly by the collar of his shirt, and she asked him not to be too angry when they arrived in the capital. The princess whispered in his ear that this was her last attempt to save herself. The husband did not understand her words. Admitting that he might think her crazy, she begged him to consider her importance. And then she fainted in his arms. Time passed imperceptibly and they set off on their journey to Bunnell. A journey that became for Elizabeth the path to inevitable death. She rode alongside Christian. Dusk was falling and the knights decided to set up camp on the shore of the lake. The Archduke kindly informed her that he would take care of a place for her to rest, and asked her to wait a little. The grieving girl did not care where to stay. But the man was worried that if she got sick again, their trip would have to be postponed indefinitely. The alarmed princess realized that her journey to the end was constantly being delayed. But Christian dismissed her fears. The girl was surprised and embarrassed. It seemed to her that everyone was deliberately avoiding her, perhaps because she looked tired and dirty. On the way, Elizabeth thought she saw the lake, but in a different direction. The Archduke was surprised and asked what had happened. The girl explained that there was supposedly a lake in the forest, and she wondered if she could wash there. The man was silent at first, and then he insisted on personally conducting her. The princess was indignant at such a proposal, but he was adamant, which surprised his subordinates. The irritated princess was about to express her displeasure, but then she weighed all the pros and cons, and indeed this could have been a good chance for her. And it would be even better if as many people as possible saw them together. In the end, she agreed to accompany him and they set off for the lake. The moon shone brightly, illuminating the lake with its blue light. Christian went to it and tasted the water. It seemed cold to him. He was worried about whether the princess would be comfortable, but Elizabeth assured him that everything was fine. The man warned her to be careful not to wet the wound. The girl thought she needed to try and check something, and she started taking off her raincoat and unbuttoning her shirt. The Archduke had not changed since she had first met him. However, the heat emanating from his strong body that had received her that day was still remembered. She was left in one shirt, and she began to unbutton the last button on her chest, calling out to Sir Christian. But he warned that the wind was still cold, and he began to throw the shirt that had fallen off his shoulder back on. The girl said that she wanted to wash her whole body, but the Archduke, buttoning her up, warned her. It hadn't even been 3 days since her fever had subsided. He whispered in her ear, begging not to put him to the test. His voice trembled, betraying an inner struggle. After all, he had already made it clear that he could not help her. Elizabeth felt crushed and defiled, like a flower trampled in a swamp. Princess Argan, proud and unapproachable, who appeared before the commander of the enemy army in the guise of a pitiful captive. Her honor was trampled in the mud. And yet, despite her humiliation, he remained honest and steadfast in his knightly honor. Like a rock in the midst of a stormy sea, the man stepped carefully, fearing the slippery moss on the stones, and warned her of the danger. Then, looking anxiously at the princess, he reported, as for the nearest village with a hotel, they would reach it tomorrow. He begged them to wait another day. It was unwise to change the route at their own discretion. The girl asked only for permission to wash her hands and feet. Her eyes were clouded with thought. She slowly approached the lake, stepping into the cool water. Her thoughts were racing, she asked herself. Could a noble man with such a pure soul forgive? What did she plan to do in Benalla? It was mid-March. A month and a half had already passed since Elizabeth had been captured by the knights. Finally, they reached the Benel Empire, which was located in the northwestern part of the continent. From the hill, they could see a magnificent palace. The Archduke was helping the princess dismount from her horse when an excited Reger ran up to him. He announced that Yanok-si-hat, the prince of the Ugal kingdom, had arrived. Elizabeth shuddered with fear. The assistant, noticing her reaction, added that they did not expect the prince to arrive at the castle. Suddenly, the voice of Sihat was heard, addressing the Archduke. He did not hide his audacity and asked if it was he who had captured Princess Argana. The prince expressed curiosity as to whether she was nearby. It is known that Ugal is an old enemy of Argon. It was they who inflicted a devastating defeat on the empire. The girl felt herself trembling, but Christian noticed it and held her tightly to him, trying to calm her down. Yanok-si-hat did not hide his displeasure. He traveled a long way to the imperial castle of Argana, eager to see her incomparable face. However, she escaped. The prince, having heard of her legendary beauty, considered it his duty to see her at least once before his inevitable death. Regretting the lost opportunity, he turned to his brother, Master Bunnell, with a persistent request to deliver her unharmed. He bowed before the Archduke and expressed his ardent desire to receive such a valuable gift. When the prince reached out to touch the princess, she involuntarily shuddered, gripped by fear of the magic circle's possible reaction. The Archduke did not allow him to do this and ordered him to leave. He sternly explained that he had been ordered to deliver the princess to Benel, but not to hand her over to Ugal, and he emphasized that this required the emperor's personal permission. Until His Highness issued an order, the captive would remain under Benella's jurisdiction. Christian made no ambiguity. He declared that the princess would be under his care. He held out his hand to her and they headed for the palace. Yanok-si-hat was furious, clenching his fists, unable to hide his irritation. He mentally promised that they would see who would win. They were greeted with loud greetings at the palace. His Highness awaited the Archduke in a spacious hall, seated on a high throne. Emperor Benella Neuer Erderic. He expressed his praise to the commander-in-chief for the successful completion of the mission. His Highness questioned Regé, wanting to know if the princess had shown disobedience to the Archduke. Christian, kneeling before the emperor, assured him that everything was calm. There were no signs of rebellion. The emperor thought, lost in thought. He believed that the princess had long since ended her life, so her unexpected appearance aroused his suspicions. The archduke remembered how she had begged in the camp not to be left alone for a moment, and also the mysterious words about coming to the capital and the request not to be angry. The emperor reported that Ugel had demanded the princess be handed over to him. He was curious to know if he himself wanted to cut her throat. Christian was surprised to learn that they planned to kill her. The emperor confirmed this, adding that after that they wanted to make a scarecrow out of her. Reget hoped that the emperor would not give his permission, but His Highness explained that she was the last of the imperial family. He reported that they had agreed to take her to the square and publicly execute her, and then hand over the body to Ugel. The archduke asked when the execution would take place. The emperor said in 5 days, believing that this would put an end to the dependence of the Argan states. His Highness pondered. If the young emperor had not been so proud, he might have survived. Imagining himself in his place, he would have begged Ugel. The emperor noticed that Reget, standing before him, was clearly distracted and lost in his own thoughts. Curious, he asked what he was thinking about. The archduke faintly faded away, and in a calm voice he assured that there was nothing special in his thoughts. The emperor, knowing his brother's honesty, noticed the falsehood in his words. He was surprised that Reget did not understand his hints. The archduke replied that he did not understand anything, which caused His Highness's confusion. After that, silence fell. The emperor broke the silence and asked, had anything unusual happened to the princess during their journey? This question surprised the archduke. Christian calmly replied that nothing had happened. His memory involuntarily returned to the episode at the lake, when the princess tried to seduce him. The emperor, despite his assurances, insisted that he rest, reminding him that even dragons need rest. His Highness got down to business. He insisted that the archduke review the updated list of brides in his office. The man expressed his dissatisfaction with Christian's long wait and reminded him of the reasons for his appointment to the position. When the archduke appeared in the palace, the emperor noted that dragons with human qualities were a valuable inheritance that could not be lost. Seeing the frightened boy, His Highness gently extended his hand to him, suggesting that he take it and trust the man. Christian reminded the emperor of his repeated warnings. In the case of marriage, the birth of an heir remains an extremely difficult matter. Even if the woman can bear his family, her life will be in danger. She will die during childbirth. The emperor insisted, citing the example of his mother who gave birth to an archduke, as proof of the possibility of producing an heir despite the difficulties. Christian, having reported his fatigue, was about to leave. The dissatisfied emperor expressed his opinion after him, that refusing to marry would doom the archduke to a lonely old age and death. And emphasizing his complex character, he said goodbye. As Christian walked down the corridor, his mind kept returning to the emperor's words, to his self-confident assertion that his mother had done it. Unlike the emperor, he knew the bitter truth. His birth cost his mother her life. A half-dragon was born, terrifying in its nature. Each was born through a brutal dissection of the mother's womb, and almost every woman who dared to give them life died in agony. That was why Christian was adamant in his decision not to marry. He could not bear to witness such a horror again. With every moment spent within these walls, his irritation grew. The man felt that returning to Rotier would be a wise move. But before leaving the palace walls, his heart longed to see the princess for at least a moment, doomed to the darkness of the dungeon. He didn't know how to behave during their meeting. When he arrived at the dungeon, he saw her in heavy metal shackles. Christian carefully removed the shackles and bandaged her injured wrists with a soft cloth, trying to ease the pain. Elizabeth, watching him, could not understand his intentions. Immersed in thoughts about this strange man, she suddenly heard the insolent voice of Sihat. The prince expressed his curiosity about the emperor's beauty. This provoked an angry exclamation of his name from Elizabeth. He was pleased that she remembered him, and he persistently tried to find out the truth, but only ran into a wall of misunderstanding. In anger, Sihat called her a fool. He wondered how she could have been unaware of the emperor's transfer of his magical power. Images of magic circles flashed through her mind. The princess assumed that he meant them, but she realized that this secret was known only to her and her brother. Sihat abruptly opened the door and burst into the dungeon, determined to test her life force and unleash her magical abilities. The prince opened the door and reached out, trying to touch Elizabeth. She was seized by panic, desperately seeking salvation, trying to protect herself. As her gaze froze, she heard a dull thud. Opening her eyes, the princess saw Sihat unconscious on the floor, and the Archduke towered over him. The girl was shocked by his unexpected appearance. Her mind still could not comprehend the true intentions of this mysterious man. Christian showed unexpected concern for the condemned prisoner. He protected her wounded wrists from the shackles and saved her from the prince's cruelty. Perhaps he was only following the emperor's orders, helping the weak. Or did he have other deeper motives? Her heart was filled with boundless gratitude. Fragile and frightened, Elizabeth silently thanked her savior, and she swore in her mind that she would never forget his kindness. The day had come when Elizabeth Isaac was to be executed. The Archduke, preparing to depart, was about to leave the palace walls. His faithful assistant Reuben reported that all that remained was to load the gifts handed over to him from the hands of His Majesty. Christian, gathering his horse, nodded in agreement. He added that as soon as everything was ready, they would set off immediately. Reuben, not holding back his indignation, expressed sincere surprise at the Archduke's reluctance to visit the square. But Christian did not understand the reason for such insistence. The assistant, scratching the back of his head in confusion, reminded him of the execution of the princess at noon. So everything will begin soon, and a crowd has gathered on the square since morning, thirsty for a cruel spectacle. The aide added that the crowd gathered in the square relished the gossip, and some even expected a miracle, such as the magical disappearance of the princess. Christian had no more patience to listen to the empty chatter, and he ordered the boy to stop his nonsense and check if they had forgotten anything important. After all, he had no intention of returning to the capital anytime soon. Reuben asked the commander-in-chief again about the visit to the square, but he met only an indifferent look from Christian, who saw no point in his presence there. The assistant reminded him of the princess's escort for almost 2 months, and besides, the boy noticed their close, intimate, and secret relationship. Christian, not wanting to waste time, ordered them to prepare for departure immediately. The depressed assistant dismissed the doubt regarding the absence of any relationship between Christian and the princess. At that moment the clock rang, announcing the arrival of noon. The Archduke mounted his horse and gave the order to set off. Suddenly a maid ran out of the palace chambers. Her face was distorted with anxiety. She called out breathlessly for the Archduke, informing of an immediate summons to His Majesty, and she whispered something inaudibly about Princess Argan. The Emperor, having received the princess in his chambers, awaited her words. He felt that she had something important to say. Elizabeth, kneeling before His Highness, hesitated, realizing that she had already crossed the line of a worthy death. Her people, the people of Argan, loved her without even seeing her face, but the princess failed to live up to their expectations. Elizabeth felt the weight of betrayal weighing on her shoulders, for she had turned away from them, trying to escape alone. But the princess knew that she had to survive, to give her brother a dignified burial, and to appease the grieving spirit of the Argan people, who had been defeated by the barbarians. The Emperor saw her inner struggle, called her. Over the past month she had mentally relived this moment hundreds of times, and now, in a trembling voice, she announced that she was carrying Archduke Christian's child. This news could have been a turning point in her fate. His Highness was stunned, unable to believe his own ears. She said she was carrying the Archduke's child. The princess confirmed, leaving no doubt. The Emperor was astonished that Regé had spent the night with a woman on the battlefield, unable to believe such a possibility. However, after a moment's hesitation, he informed her, not knowing if she had heard, that Archduke Christian was not entirely human, but half-dragon. The Emperor asked if she knew that a human woman could not bear the family of a half-dragon. The princess remained silent, her head lowered, and whether she was aware of the consequences when she agreed. He also wondered how the princess found out about her pregnancy, and what evidence she had. Elizabeth told about her twin brother, a wizard, and that she checked the condition of her body with the help of the magic that flowed within her. She didn't have the same power as her brother, but she could use a small amount of magic to feel changes in her body. The Emperor listened attentively, pondering. Wasn't this an attempt to delay the execution? He dared to ask her about it directly. The princess bowed low before the Emperor. Placing her hand on her heart, she insisted that the decision rested with His Highness. The Emperor objected, claiming that the Archduke would make the decision. At that moment, the palace doors opened and Christian entered. His Majesty turned to the Archduke and asked displeasedly whether the princess's words were true, but the man did not know what exactly she had said. The enraged Emperor demanded an immediate answer. First, Christian asked permission to speak to the princess alone, His Highness impatiently tapped the throne, making it clear that he had no intention of waiting. The Archduke took this as permission and led the princess out of the palace. The Lord, returning to Sir Reuben, ordered him to reveal every detail of their journey. He wanted to know everything. What exactly happened between the princess and the Archduke on the way to the capital? And he asked not to miss a single detail. In the silence of the garden alone, Christian, filled with anger, turned to the princess, calling her crazy and demanding an explanation of what she was up to. Elizabeth, heartbroken, barely audibly apologized, but the angry husband rejected her apology. He wanted to know why she had lied. With pain in her voice, the girl replied that he knew the reason himself. She didn't want to die and had to do something to survive. But Christian insisted that the princess could have found another, smarter way, without involving him in deception in front of the ruler. Alarmed, she asked fearfully if he had allowed her to choose another path. The Archduke assured her that if he had known her intentions, he would have found another way out. But the princess bitterly objected, stubbornly insisting that he would simply ignore her pleas. Elizabeth knew he would simply ignore her, as he had done so many times before. The Archduke had openly stated that he had no intention of helping her, and he even assumed that she had already been executed in the square. Despite the meager care he showed out of pity, Christian had no intention of saving her. She knew that the emperor desired an heir, so she informed him that she was carrying a child, and she strongly suggested that the Archduke use her. The princess understood that Christian was annoyed by the idea of forced conception. She thought it made sense to him too and asked him to think about it. The Archduke reminded her that she had just declared her readiness to accept a horrible death, and he asked if she really wanted to bear him a child. He also asked if she understood why, despite the emperor's fervent desire to have an heir, it had not yet happened. If Elizabeth had known the truth from the beginning, she wouldn't have made such an offer, as her only motive was survival. Christian walked over to her, took her hands in his, and thought that even with a slight push on her wrists, he could easily break her bones. He was worried about why he seemed so self-assured in her eyes, and whether he was missing something important. Every time he looked at her, the princess shuddered. She felt fear squeezing her heart. She understood his thoughts. Christian's face was impenetrable, as if he had not seen her despair. She apologized bitterly for having tarnished his honor. In response, he reminded her in a rough voice that he had already said that he could not help her. The Archduke assured her that he would not prevent her from saving her life. In her place, he would have begged the emperor for mercy. The princess could offer everything in return: secrets known only to her, treasures, knowledge of dragons. With a gleam of unwavering determination in her eyes, the girl made a statement that she was ready to give up everything, even her honor, but not the land that her brother and people defended. Her soul could not accept such shame. She could not and had no right to pay such a low price for her salvation. Christian regarded her with icy detachment, and wondered if she didn't think noble suicide was a fitting end for the Argan Empire. Elizabeth, looking down, realized that he had insisted on a beautiful death. The words that had once called her to life now seemed empty. She understood that even in the struggle she would not be able to change anything, and that returning to Argan would not revive the destroyed empire. Her brother's words that her survival would be a symbol of Argan's invincibility troubled her soul. She could not betray these words with death. With dignity, the princess told Christian that she was not like ordinary women. Although her magical abilities were inferior to her brother's, she still possessed power. The Archduke remained icy calm. He asked why she had so helplessly allowed herself to be taken to Benel. He arrogantly expressed his indignation that he had no desire to understand a woman who did not value her own body, so he decided to give her time to think. Christian promised to come back the next day, because he needed time to think things over. Desperation rang in the princess's voice as she declared that he was her only hope. She had made her offer, and now only his will would decide her fate. The man, without saying a word, turned around and headed towards the palace, leaving her alone with her anxious thoughts. Christian appeared before the emperor, who was impatiently awaiting his answer. The emperor was gnawed by anxiety as to whether the Archduke had spent the night with the princess. The commander-in-chief was silent in thought, embarrassed. He could not dare to tell them that they had shared the same bed. The prejudiced emperor noticed his confusion and realized that they had spent the night together. The duke, embarrassed, tried to justify himself, but His Highness, seeing his delay, understood everything. He knew that they had spent the entire time together during the journey to Benel. The ruler, who had always seen in the Archduke only cold heartlessness, had to realize and admit his mistake. Christian, filled with anger, demanded an explanation from his assistant. What had he said to His Majesty? The frightened young man looked away. He only conveyed what he had seen and heard, only the truth. How they had spent the entire journey together for a month and a half. The emperor, burning with anger, dismissed any doubts about the veracity of the information. He knew about the Archduke's visit to the princess in prison. With a faint smile full of audacity, the emperor suggested that the purpose of the visit was to check whether the princess was carrying his offspring. The Archduke maintained icy indifference, and asked why he had been summoned if the emperor was so confident in his conclusions. Although the ruler already knew the answer when Christian led the princess out of the palace, he still couldn't avoid the important question. He announced that he had sent the imperial physician to the princess for final confirmation of her pregnancy, which would only be obtained after an examination. The emperor, full of doubts, asked Regit if he was sure of his paternity. The Archduke could not understand what His Majesty meant. After all, the princess claimed that she had seduced him in the camp. The girl did not leave the castle walls, being under the close supervision of her brother. Rumors spread throughout Argon that their relationship went beyond simple brotherly love. The ruler assumed that the late emperor had an affair with his sister. Christian, unable to contain his anger, interrupted His Highness. He remarked that the emperor was defaming the honor of Princess Argon. His Majesty replied that even if the princess had lied, he had no intention of slandering her. But with a malicious glint in his eyes, he added, if she dared to lie, she would not escape punishment. The emperor would give her alive to Prince Ugol, and then the twins would meet in the afterlife. The deeply troubled Archduke bowed his head, and with a barely audible sadness in his voice, he said that he did not know what her life was like in Argon. He drew conclusions from his own observations. The princess was not one to resort to base acts and debauchery. The attentive Christian took into account her poor health. Even ordinary tasks were given to the princess with great difficulty. Doubting, the lord asked if the princess was really carrying his child. Christian replied with unwavering confidence that she had not known another man. After speaking with the emperor, he walked silently down the long corridor, lost in thought. The man of high status turned out to be the embodiment of virtue, a woman he longed to touch at least once in his life. Her lust for life and fearless courage impressed Christian to the core. Deep in thought, the Archduke walked on. Suddenly, he asked his assistant where Princess Argon was. Reuben reported that she was in the west wing of the palace with the doctor. The Archduke, full of determination, rushed there. The assistant tried to catch up with him, but in vain. In the end, Christian firmly decided that he would fulfill her wish. The doctor, carefully examining the disguised princess, felt her weak pulse, which made it very difficult to make a diagnosis. Elizabeth's weakened and exhausted state caused the doctor to worry. The princess explained that this was her peculiarity, which did not interfere with her normal life. However, the doctor insisted on a blood test, believing that this would help establish an accurate diagnosis. The princess agreed, but at the same time her heart clenched with anxiety. The next day everyone would find out about her deception. Sadness enveloped her soul. The night fell silent over the palace, and the princess fell into a deep sleep. Suddenly she felt a man's hand touch her forehead. Opening her eyes, she saw Christian, and she barely audibly expressed surprise at his appearance in her dream, if he hadn't planned to help. Elizabeth agreed with his words. Her life should have ended long ago, but she still held on to him. She made a promise to the Archduke, who was sitting next to her. When her deception was revealed, she would end her suffering. With the first rays of the sun, Elizabeth opened her eyes. She saw before her the smiling face of a young girl who joyfully greeted her awakening. The surprised princess asked about her identity. The girl introduced herself as Ivesa, and from now on she was her personal servant, ready to fulfill any request. The stunned princess could not understand why a servant doomed to death was being given to her. Ivesa said that she was ready to fulfill any of her requests. Shocked, Elizabeth asked who had given such an order. The maid replied that it was, of course, His Highness the Archduke. This news shocked the princess, but Ivesa, as if not noticing her shock, calmly added that Elizabeth would soon become his wife. That morning, the Archduke visited Elizabeth in her chambers. He inquired after her well-being, informing her that she had been unconscious in bed for 3 days. The princess remembered only scattered fragments, which seemed like delirium from exhaustion. She felt better and was surprised to find that she had miraculously survived. Christian noted that achieving the goal was a troublesome and annoying affair. If he could get rid of the imperial yoke with one deal, that would be ideal. Elizabeth listened attentively, and the Archduke continued to emphasize her exceptional suitability for making a deal. Her Highness was a descendant of the hero who had defeated the dragon, and he was a half-blood, with the blood of that beast flowing in his veins. Perhaps their union could tame the power of his dragon blood. Elizabeth expressed her hope uncertainly. Christian reported that the Emperor believed in their night together. He also bribed his doctor, who would continue her treatment from now on. The alarmed princess tried to express her gratitude to the Archduke for accepting her difficult proposal. He coldly replied that gratitude was inappropriate. After all, they would simply use each other by mutual consent, and their union was only a marriage by contract. The Archduke announced the terms of the agreement, setting the term of their contract at 6 months, and he asked the princess for her consent. Elizabeth thought for a moment. She understood that the Emperor was very suspicious, and if her belly didn't round out in that time, he would definitely suspect something. She realized that she had to carry out the Archduke's order and become pregnant within 6 months. Therefore, she gave her consent. While preparing the papers, he warned her that if she failed, he would reveal the whole truth to the Emperor, and then her fate would be completely in the hands of His Grace. His icy gaze and unwavering manner of speaking were familiar to her. The sad princess realized that she had been prepared for such a cold attitude. The Archduke announced that he and 2 knights would guard Her Highness for 6 months. Elizabeth timidly tried to speak, but her voice trembled with uncertainty. She knew he might not approve of her presence. He probably wouldn't have it easy with an unwanted woman. However, the princess begged Christian to promise that he would not reject her. The husband was surprised by her request and remained silent. Elizabeth waited anxiously for an answer. Finally, with a slight smile, he replied that he was glad. As far as she could tell, the children had not appeared out of nowhere. The princess turned away and muttered that she was not so stupid. Then her ears turned red and she felt embarrassed. Christian offered her an option. If something was bothering her, they could write down their obligations and responsibilities for not fulfilling them on paper. The princess quickly ran her eyes over the paragraph that mentioned their close relationship. 5 times during the term, on the days determined by the doctor. She thought for a moment. That meant 5 times a month and 30 times in 6 months. That seemed too little to her, so she looked at Christian pitifully and pointed with her fingers. That the number needed to be doubled, or maybe tripled. The Archduke, running his hand over his forehead, asked Her Highness to simply state that their meetings would take place as often as circumstances permitted. He didn't want it to look like homework with a specific number. The princess, full of enthusiasm, agreed, and she quickly corrected her demands in the document. She wrote everything she thought was necessary. Then she announced that she had already completed the signing of the agreement. The contract expired on October 1st, giving her 6 months to conceive. If successful, the term would be extended to 10 months. Elizabeth pondered all this, carefully studying the papers. At that moment, the Archduke said something important in a calm voice. The man assured her that she could leave at any moment. Elizabeth asked again, and he confirmed, emphasizing that if she could, of course. So she's safe for now. Now she'll have enough time to find a way to get back to Argon, and she can't waste a single chance. Coming close to Christian, she firmly declared that she was abandoning her intention to run away. This statement surprised him. A few days later, the wedding of the Archduke and princess took place. They stood solemnly dressed at the altar. Everyone present was eagerly awaiting the event. Elizabeth was wearing a gorgeous dress, but her face was clouded with sadness. She remembered how if Andrew had seen this, he would have been stunned. And she remembered his words, when he said he would find her the best man on the continent, a good man who would take care of her, and she will have the most beautiful dress. They will receive blessings in front of everyone, and they will have the best wedding. Her brother promised that he would arrange for them celebrations more luxurious and grandiose than those of the Emperor. Therefore, he asked her to promise him that she would also take care of her health. Elizabeth clutched the bouquet tightly in her trembling hands. Before her stood the courageous and handsome Archduke. The priest began to deliver a solemn speech, claiming that as God's representative, he seals their marriage union, and as a sign of confirmation of the oath, they must kiss. The princess shuddered in surprise. The priest insisted that the kiss would be a visible sign of their sincerity before God. Christian looked down at the princess. There was a palpable tension between them. The princess blushed with embarrassment, and the Archduke did not take his eyes off her. Then he turned them to the Emperor, who was watching their union, sitting on the first pew of the temple. Christian remembered a conversation with the ruler, who insisted on the need for marriage and the birth of an heir. The Emperor advised him to marry a girl from a noble family. If the Archduke had not hesitated to express his feelings for the princess, everything might have turned out differently. But Christian tried to say something, but the angry ruler assured him that he shouldn't take the situation so tragically. The Emperor claimed that the princess had seduced him in order to survive, and he, like a simpleton, had given in. The very word "gave in" irritated Christian. He clenched his fist tightly, realizing that he had succumbed to her beauty and could not resist. Now he stood motionless like a stone statue. Suddenly, the princess came up to him. She put her hand on his chest and whispered that they could just pretend. The Archduke could not understand what was guiding him, desire or instinct. Hugging her around the waist, he thought about what benefit he would get from this marriage. The man replied that if they had already decided to take this step, they should see it through to the end. And gently embracing her face, he kissed her passionately. Perhaps it was a sin to dare to possess Princess Argan of his own free will, but he indulged in a passionate kiss, mentally deciding that if that was the case, then he was ready to accept the consequences, and there was no need to hesitate. The princess trembled during the kiss. When they finished kissing, Christian glanced at his subordinates. They were stunned. Then he looked at the embarrassed princess. The priest pronounced them officially husband and wife. The Archduke held the bewildered princess to his chest with a strong hand. The monarch announced the end. After the wedding ceremony, the newlyweds set off on their journey. The princess was sent to the Archduke's estate, while he left on urgent business. She watched him drive away from the carriage window. It seemed as if something extraordinary had happened at the estate that had caused him to leave her so soon after the wedding. Ivesa remarked with admiration that Her Highness looked wonderful in that dress. She was indignant that her husband had not even had time to admire her properly. The upset princess suggested that the Archduke was not impressed by her beauty. The maid was shocked and began to prove otherwise. She assured him that the knights never took their eyes off Elizabeth, despite the fact that she was their master's wife, and that was unacceptable. The princess was surprised because she did not know this. She remembered his kiss. Suddenly she heard his voice. He was standing at the window of the carriage and asked her to get out. Frightened, Elizabeth thought something bad had happened, but the man remained silent in response. Then he gently stroked her face with his strong hand, and he noticed that the sun wasn't so scorching. After all, a long stay in a carriage would have a negative effect on her health. He suggested that they go riding together. The maid, struck by their closeness, glanced at them, full of curiosity, which also did not go unnoticed by the Archduke's knights. The princess felt uncomfortable. Christian, noticing her, carefully pulled the hood over her. He thought it would make her more comfortable. His concern drew surprised looks from the knights. Although the sun was not scorching, he wanted to protect the princess, decided to play it safe. However, she was indignant that she could not see anything and expressed her dissatisfaction. He calmed her down in a soft voice, promising to personally escort her. They rode as one, the princess like a fragile flower hidden in the Archduke's strong embrace. His heart sank with anxiety for her health. He believed that a long stay in a confined space could not but affect her well-being. Elizabeth smiled, not sharing his concern. After all, 2 days in a carriage did not seem like anything extraordinary to her. Looking intently at her face, he hinted that if she wanted to go for a walk, she should definitely let him know about her desire. Christian felt a thin veil of incomprehension enveloping her words, and he sought to dispel her silent reclusiveness. However, the princess, not hiding her feelings, assured him that she was really comfortable in the carriage. She was used to being alone. After all, she spent most of her life in her own chambers, where silence and solitude became her reliable companions. The Archduke, struck by her words, thought for a moment. He tried to understand how a young girl could voluntarily lock herself away in her own fortress, but she strongly denied his assumptions. She claimed that no one held her captive except her own nature, loneliness, and reflections. The fragile princess, staying in the courtyard for a long time, risked getting sick. However, her heart was filled with warmth from the memories of walks in the garden with her brother. Occasional walks in the garden dispelled the gloom of her dreary days. Despite the joy, the next morning the princess felt exhausted and sickly. That day she was surprised to feel an unusual lightness in her body. After a month and a half of imprisonment, the traces of the shackles had almost disappeared. leaving only pale shadows on her delicate skin. Christian carefully examined her hands. She was amazed. It was the first time she had seen such rapid healing. 10 days had passed since that terrible moment. Her brother's words, full of concern, rang in her memory. He assured her that she would recover and asked her to trust him. Andrew was right. The princess was feeling much better. The Archduke quietly spoke his approval. When she asked, he answered evasively that nothing had happened. He saw her resilience, but he couldn't understand how such a fragile girl could be so strong. The disappearance of the traces of the shackles seemed long. He was worried about how her fragile body would withstand the test of a half-dragon. Christian's thoughts were filled with anxiety and worry. So he suggested a short rest in a nearby village. The princess, noticing his fatigue, assumed that the Archduke was exhausted. Suddenly, Reuben interrupted their conversation, knowing that the Archduke knew no fatigue. The princess, sensing his tension, thought that he was exhausted after the long ride. Suddenly, Elizabeth ordered the horse to stop immediately, feeling that they could not go any further. Her heart was troubled by the premonition that someone was watching them. Tension tightened the air around them. The princess pointed to the 12 o'clock direction and 2 o'clock to the right. Suddenly, a crackling sound was heard from the bushes, and arrows rained down on them. Christian warned of the attack and ordered them to prepare for defense and to take the princess to the center. Reuben instantly carried out the order, picking her up. The princess, seized by fear, clutched tightly at the Archduke's cloak, begging him to be careful. Her body trembled with excitement. The Archduke ordered his assistant to act quickly. He himself quickly rushed in the direction from which the arrows were flying. The knights formed a human shield and protected Her Highness, but deadly arrows continued to rain down from the darkness. Reuben ordered the princess and her maid to immediately hide in the carriage. Noticing the poisoned arrows, she warned the Sir of the danger. Her memory took her back to the terrible events in Argonne, where she had seen similar weapons before. She whispered that they were Ugel's arrows, her voice trembling with terror. The angry knight grumbled about the annoying barbarians. But Elizabeth, trembling with fear, felt that it was her presence that had provoked the attack. She remembered her brother's words. He had told her about the magic circles on her body that allowed her to cast simple defensive and offensive spells. To activate the circle, it was enough to place a hand on it and name it. The princess, gathering her remaining strength, placed her hand on the circle and loudly shouted the name Andri. Instantly, a bright blue dome lit up around the carriage. Christian, who was nearby, noticed this phenomenon and immediately realized that it was protective magic. Appearing, Prince Ugela confidently declared that the appearance of magic was predictable, and hinted to Christian that he knew why he had intercepted the woman. He asked if Elizabeth Isaac had revealed a secret to him, why Emperor Argan valued his sister more than himself. The Archduke, not understanding what was being said, made Sihat assume that he had fallen in love with a fox. The prince ordered Christian to stop his love games and give up the princess's head, and he would no longer interfere with the Archduke's plans. Christian gritted his teeth and flatly refused to give up the princess. His anger reached its limit, and he asked what the prince intended to do with her head. He warned Sihat not to even think about making such a mistake, especially with a creature that wasn't human. At that moment, the Archduke's hand began to take on the features of a dragon, and in a menacing voice he announced that they had fearlessly attacked the Knights of Rotir. He didn't care why they needed a princess, but Christian couldn't stand the prince's disgusting eyes. His powerful, ugly hand grabbed the man by the neck, lifting him above him. The Archduke's hand, like a steel bolt of lightning, pierced Sihat. Then it mercilessly threw the lifeless body into the thicket of the forest. The prince's last words were a hoarse warning to Christian about the cunning fox, who would drink everything out of him and leave, and disappear, like Emperor Argan. The momentary crash of the carriage's fall shattered the silence. The Archduke froze. His thoughts instantly plunged into the abyss of fear that the chariot had shattered into pieces. Hiding in the carriage, the princess and the maid trembled with terror. Ivesta, full of anxiety, kept asking if Her Highness was all right. Suddenly, a heavy and ominous silence fell around, foreshadowing imminent disaster. The maid noticed how frightened her mistress was. The princess looked down at her hands, and a disturbing feeling came over her that the magical protection was weakening. Her heart sank with worry for Christian. Like a shadow, one of the barbarians approached the carriage, intending to push it into the abyss. Elizabeth, noticing this, instantly pushed the assistant aside. Ivesta screamed in surprise. Suddenly, the carriage, losing its support, quickly fell off the cliff, carrying Her Highness into the abyss. Hearing Reuben, the Archduke rushed to help. The assistant reported the weakening of the magical barrier. The enemies took advantage of the moment and pushed the carriage. The knight did not have time to prevent this, but he learned that Her Highness had managed to push Avesta away, leaving her alone in the carriage. To reach the lake, it was necessary to go around the valley. The assistant insisted on descending immediately. But Christian stood still, lost in thought. He suggested that the princess's death in the lake was an act of mercy. After all, a tragic fate awaited her inevitably, either during mating with a half-dragon. Whether from a ruptured womb as a child or on the gallows when the truth was revealed, Elizabeth Isaac was doomed to a sad end. Reuben waited tensely for the order. The Archduke silently turned and walked away, his fists clenched. Suddenly accelerating, he jumped down from the cliff. As Elizabeth sank into the icy water, she wondered if this was her last moment. She wondered if God had truly chosen this death for her. The princess believed that if death were inevitable, it would be better if it came sooner, so that she could preserve the honor of Princess Argana. The words of her brother, who had given his life to save her, came to her mind. He begged her to never lose hope. Her brother claimed that she was capable of feats that he was not capable of. He longed to hear from her an oath that she would always fight. Elizabeth desperately tried to get to the surface. Fighting the cold current, she felt the water filling her lungs. Suddenly, one of the magic circles on her back activated, and she quickly began to emerge to the surface. Under the water, the princess saw the Archduke's outstretched hand. He wasted no time trying to pull her out of the icy water. They arrived on the shore safe and sound. De Christian, trying to bring her to her senses, gently breathed life-giving air into her. Opening her eyes, Elizabeth saw the Archduke's worried face. His gaze was filled with anxiety. He was trying to make sure she was okay. But what caught her attention were his eyes, as clear as blue lakes. Looking back, she realized that all this time he had been constantly caring for her. Only now, having experienced his own storm, which he had witnessed more than once, did the princess feel the depth of his concern. Christian held her tightly, warming her with his warmth. She said that thanks to him she had survived again, that she was still alive. He held her even tighter. In the castle of Argan there was an oppressive silence as before a storm. The doctor, with pity in his voice, announced the sad news. The princess's life hung in the balance. She lay on the bed, exhausted and weak. Her brother, overcome with despair, helplessly watched his sister's suffering. Her body was burning, and childhood memories full of pain and suffering came back to life, like ghosts of the past that haunted her. As a child, Elizabeth spent most of her time in bed. Looking at her brother, she rejoiced at his health and felt a quiet envy. She did not understand why illnesses overtook her so often. The princess was annoyed by the constant feeling of weakness and pain. The disease also changed her hair, making it dull and lifeless. With each new illness, the color of her brown hair became more faded. With his characteristic sincerity, Andrei allayed his sister's concerns. He invariably assured her that her hair was a true adornment. Her brother always tried to comfort Elizabeth, but her heart ached when she saw his face, disfigured by suffering. Over time, as the princess grew older, she learned to hide her own torment, assuring her brother that everything was fine. She is no longer a child and the illness has receded. She had to curb her burning jealousy, repeating over and over again that everything is fine, but she had no idea that this silence would cause her even greater pain. The inability to share her physical pain broke her spirit. She balanced on the edge where life met death. Elizabeth cursed her weakness, which had plunged her into the abyss of loneliness. The doctor, like a messenger of fate, brought the princess a small bottle of medicine. The man strictly ordered her to take it drop by drop. An overdose, given her fragility, could have been a deadly potion. But one day, in a fit of desperation, she dared to drink it all to the bottom. Seeing her in this state, her brother was shocked and devastated. He felt that his guilt weighed heavily on her suffering. Sobs escaped his chest, his voice trembling. He begged her not to go, not to leave him alone with this cruel world. The brother felt powerless, unable to save her from the abyss. But Andrei, considering the unbearable torment that tormented her, gathered his will into a fist and decided to act. When Elizabeth had recovered a little, he announced his intention, to draw magic circles on her body. After warning her of the pain, he asked her to endure it. The surprised princess asked what this strange magic was, but Andrei remained silent. Later he explained that it was a spell capable of eradicating the cause of her illness. From that day on, her brother drew amazing patterns on her body every day. Circles of attack, defense, self-healing. He explained the meaning of each of them, but he stubbornly kept quiet about that first mysterious magic circle. Andri was hiding a deep secret about the spell he had cast on her that fateful day. The princess and her companions, the knights, stopped for the night in a small settlement, choosing a cozy hotel for their rest. Christian, drenched in moisture, carefully carried the soaked princess in his arms. Feeling her shiver, he gently laid her on the bed as if she were a treasure. Elizabeth wondered if it was true that they would be staying at the hotel for a few days. She was worried about the Archduke's urgent business, which could not wait. He replied that the strongest knight would not remain unharmed after falling from a cliff into a lake, but the princess insisted that she was fine. Elizabeth was surprised to realize that she felt no pain, not even a hint of broken bones. Only one word flashed through her mind: magic. Suddenly, her memory returned to the moment when the magic circle flashed in the water, and her body reacted in a strange way. At that moment, Reuben knocked on the door. He announced that the bath was ready, asking if he could go. Christian ordered him that he was free. The assistant asked about the punishment. Christian, raising his voice, ordered that from noon until night no one, including himself, should enter their room. Elizabeth was concerned about the punishment awaiting the Knights of Rotira. The Archduke calmly but firmly explained that they had not carried out the order properly. They had failed to protect their master and therefore deserved their just punishment. He assured her that she need not worry. He also said that Ivesta had a hand injury. A minor one, but it was inconvenient for her to use it. Therefore, he decided that he would take on the duties of her assistant. The princess was astonished. They were to live in the same room. The Archduke leaned closer with a serious expression on his face. He said that there was nothing strange about a husband and wife sharing a room. Elizabeth lowered her eyes in shame. She asked how he was going to help her, since she needed to take a bath. The princess, feeling uncomfortable, insisted that she could do it herself. Christian gently touched her face with his courageous hand and leaned in close. He felt her entire body shudder. He insisted that she must get rid of her wet clothes immediately. Elizabeth felt a blush of embarrassment flood her face. She whispered embarrassedly that she would manage on her own. He saw her fingers trembling, barely obedient, and he realized that she was not capable of doing it. Without waiting for permission, he gently took her hand in his. He lightly touched her lips and said that he would allow himself to help. He asked her not to push him away. The Archduke assured her that refusing her help would be a bitter disappointment to him. Elizabeth considered his determination. She realized that even the most fervent attempts to push him away would be unsuccessful. The thought of inevitable intimacy, of conceiving a child, forced her to resign herself. The princess silently nodded her consent. He wasted no time in approaching her. He carefully took her hand and began to help her free herself from her wet clothes. Elizabeth's heart pounded wildly, beating a rhythm of confusion and excitement as he draped the sheet over her bare shoulders. She caught a faint shadow of anger flickering across his face, but she couldn't fathom the reason for this sudden change in his mood. Soaking in the warmth of the bath, the princess pondered the strange incident in the lake. She was sure that some unknown force had pushed. The sensations were remarkably similar to those that had accompanied her first attempts at magic at camp. A strange sense of changes taking place inside her body. She had no idea what exactly Andri had done to her body, but she intuitively felt that it was somehow connected to that strange push. Christian stood behind the screen and asked how she was feeling. He assured her that he was always ready to help if she needed his support. The princess, feeling uneasy, asked with pity if he was angry with her. He was surprised by her question and did not understand what she was talking about. She looked down and said sadly that his behavior and voice seemed more severe to her than usual. Elizabeth knew she deserved his anger. After all, it had all happened because of her, because Ugel had targeted her. Others were hurt and his plans were changed. She was tormented by guilt because she was constantly causing him trouble. She tried to unravel the mystery of her own essence, searching for an answer to a painful question. Why was she always the cause of his problems? Christian assured her that he was not angry and reminded her of their agreement. She would give him an heir and he would ensure her safety. The basis of their agreement was mutual assistance, so he considered himself guilty of what had happened, and he acknowledged her right to be angry. The Archduke should not have left her unprotected. It was undoubtedly a mistake that, in a momentary impulse, he was unable to leave the battlefield in time. The impulse that clouded his mind was not caused by hostility towards the Ugel kingdom, but rather by resentment at their insatiable desire for the princess. He couldn't let her be hurt again. But when he saw the carriage that had fallen, a thought involuntarily flashed through his mind. That it was even for the best. Christian wondered if it was normal for his thoughts to be so contradictory. And he explained that it was all because he had momentarily forgotten her importance. He promised to do everything he could to make her worry no more. The princess, coming out from behind the screen, asked if he really thought she was important. The man was silent for a moment and then spoke softly. That of all the people who had ever been under his protection, she was the most precious and important. It had been like this until now, and it would continue like this for another 6 months, while their contract lasted. He carefully took a clean towel and draped it over her shoulders. Elizabeth grabbed his shirt and begged him not to push her away. She didn't need him to make the first move, but she asked him not to refuse her when he had the courage. She knew that he was the only support she had left, after she had lost everything. The only thing the princess could hold on to was the ill-considered contract they had made. If he turned away, she would disappear forever into the dark waters of the lake. There were no safe places for her anymore. Any place where he wasn't around turned into that lake bottom, that deadly rock. She begged Christian not to trust her to other people, asked him to promise her. Looking into her eyes, he took her hand and hugged her, and he made a promise. Night had fallen on the hotel rooms, immersing everything in the soft flickering of candles. The princess was soundly asleep, and Christian, sitting next to her, was carefully studying the documents. Suddenly, the silence of the room was broken by the barely audible mumbling of the princess, who had been complaining of the cold in her sleep and had begun to toss and turn. He carefully touched her face and was surprised to feel that despite all his efforts to warm her, the warmth was strangely slipping from her body. The embarrassed Archduke lay down next to her and hugged her tenderly, hoping to share his warmth, like a shield to protect her from the cold. Elizabeth woke up and shuddered to find herself lying on his chest. He explained that she seemed frozen to him. The princess thanked him in surprise. Christian hugged her shoulders and waist with his stocky and strong arms, and she felt the warmth. Elizabeth quietly said that she was uncomfortable in this position. The man, barely audible, whispered to her not to move and continued to hug her. She felt something hard and was filled with confusion. The Archduke asked her not to pay attention, but her confusion only increased. Trying to diffuse the situation, he said that she could take it as preparation. After all, she herself insisted on it. The princess did not know what to answer. Christian held her tightly. She sat on his lap, feeling his hot kisses on her neck, and his strong embrace, squeezing her hips. Elizabeth, feeling uncomfortable, pulled away. Barely restraining her impulse, he warned. If she continued to move, the situation would only get worse. Therefore, he advised her to stop. The Archduke realized that he should be more careful. After all, the princess was so fragile that she could be accidentally damaged. He admired her beauty, enchanted. It was as if he were faced with a refined work of art created by an unearthly master. His gaze, full of admiration, never left her eyes. In them was reflected the beauty that was most precious to him, then and now eternal, like the starry sky. Elizabeth sat next to him, her arms around his shoulders. He gently played with her hair, inhaling its intoxicating scent. The man did not let go of her from his strong embrace. He craved this closeness with an insatiable thirst, like a crow that has spotted a shining treasure. A week passed and they set off. The carriage carried them to Rotir, a land of harsh mountains and dense forests that darkened in the north. The princess stared out at the landscape. Ivesa said they were close. To the south, like an emerald ribbon, stretched a fertile plain, which embraced the Teni River. Mild winters made these lands, despite their northern location, as valuable as those in the south. Elizabeth's long journey ended at the pier that would become her home for the next 6 months. They approached the magnificent castle. The castle was like a giant, Rotor contemplated. The land consecrated by Benel. At the open gates of the castle, a crowd of subjects met them. That the return of His Highness the Archduke was welcomed with dignity and restraint. Christian, barely touching the ground, immediately asked about the events during his absence. Butler Alfred, with due respect, assured that peace reigned in the castle, except for a few minor issues, which he had already reported in letters. Sober, his loyal assistant, added that there were only accumulated payment details. But what impressed them the most was Pattinson, the chief maid of the castle, who, bowing low, sincerely expressed her joy at their safe return. Her alarmed look did not go unnoticed. Christian asked the reason. Mrs. lowered her eyes and hinted that in her opinion something important had happened. She had received news from Sir Reuben, and so she was infinitely glad that at last a mistress would appear en route. The Archduke, sensing that something unusual was brewing, watched intently as Mrs. Pattinson, without delay, revealed the secret. From the carriage, like a delicate flower, a princess appeared. Reuben gallantly offered her hand. Everyone present was pleasantly surprised by her appearance. The butler, as if struck by lightning, confirmed the rumors he had heard. The assistant was confused, could not believe it. That Christian had married without informing. Alfredo respectfully bowed his head and remarked that given their busy schedules, they wouldn't have time for that. However, given that His Highness the Archduke did get married, Pattinson was eager to find out who this mysterious woman had appeared out of nowhere. Christian announced the end of the greetings and invited the princess to take a walk around the castle. He extended his hand, but she refused. Elizabeth insisted that he mind his own business. Since she had forced him to change his plans, she assured him that he shouldn't worry about her. The Archduke warned the princess about the castle's complex architecture, where it was easy to get lost. She knew she could turn to the knight or Evesa for help. Christian reminded her that even Reuben couldn't protect her. The princess expressed surprise that the castle could be a dangerous place. He explained that even if the castle was not dangerous, the others were unaware of her presence, and he could not allow them to serve her without his instructions. In time they would find out, and the Archduke would not be able to accompany her always. He did not agree. Elizabeth insisted that he should not be distracted by trifles. With anger in his voice, Christian objected, showing that the situation was much more important than it seemed. But the princess did not listen to him. Pattinson noted that the high respectability has always been distinguished by stubbornness. But the new mistress seemed to be no ordinary one. Elizabeth assured him that she could handle it herself, so as not to cause him any unnecessary trouble. He objected, insisting that it was his duty. However, she insisted that she would contact someone from the castle, such as the butler or head maid, if the need arose. At that moment Alfredo appeared, offering to accompany Her Highness. She thanked him and expressed a desire to inspect the main tower and then her room. The butler bowed and invited her to follow him, adding that he would like to introduce her to his personal maids. Christian's assistant approached him, noticing the fatigue on his master's face. He suggested that he rest and get some refreshment in his office. The Archduchess, as he called her, was with Alfredo. However, the Archduke strictly ordered that she be called Princess, emphasizing her temporary status. As you ascend to the main tower, the butler warns of steep stairs. Due to frequent attacks, the bedrooms were forced to be located at the top of the tower. He told the princess about Christian, who spent most of his time in his office like a prisoner. Elizabeth, surveying the surrounding landscape, thought that this land truly lived up to its name, considering it an ideal hideout. But she understood that she shouldn't lose her vigilance. After all, her childhood illusions about the boundless beauty of the world had shattered along with the walls of Argonne. Suddenly, Christian caught up with them on the stairs. His quick return surprised the princess. His heart clenched with anxiety and he could not stay away. She was surprised, not noticing how quickly the time passed. With a gentle touch of strong hands, Christian asked her not to push him away. He reminded her, as she herself had said, his affairs required her full attention. But her poor health would keep him from concentrating. Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder, assuring him that she had no intention of pushing him away. The Archduke noticed her fatigue, but she asked him why he had difficulty climbing those stairs. He jokingly replied that he had never climbed them so quickly. In the princess's chambers, Evesa reported that the Archduke seemed to have returned to his office. She also learned from the servants that the lady had had a difficult day, and she offered to prepare the bath for her to relax in. Suddenly the door opened and Rebecca Pattinson and the maids entered. She explained that she had brought them to serve the princess, and she assured them that she had carefully prepared them so there would be no misunderstandings. Elizabeth expressed dissatisfaction with the large number of servants, believing that Evesa and one other assistant were enough for her. The head maid, however, insisted that 2 people would not be enough, considering the princess's condition. She also reported the man from Rotier, the old man who was delighted with her arrival. Pattinson added that His Highness is not a simple person. She suggested that the princess was tired after the journey. The head maid announced that she had brought the doctor from Rotiro Castle with her. The doctor who had accompanied them from Benella needed rest. To avoid possible complications, Her Highness's condition should have been checked immediately. The princess, not expecting such persistence, was shocked by Mrs. S.'s actions. Anxiety like a cold wave swept through the princess's body. An examination by Dr. Rotiro could reveal the absence of pregnancy, which made her vulnerable. Her suspicions were only strengthened when she remembered the persistence of Mrs. Pattinson, who seemed to be personally anxious to ascertain her condition. So Elizabeth, sensing a trap, insisted that she wanted to sort things out with the assistant first, postponing the examination until her doctor returned. She argued that there was no urgent need for an examination at the moment, but the missus did not back down, insisting that it would not take long, and politely asked to accept her persistence as a manifestation of the hostess's concern. The princess silently watched her. Elizabeth realized that this was not her home castle, where everyone sought her favor. She agreed to the inspection, wanting to get this over with as quickly as possible. The princess's agreement came as a pleasant surprise to Pattinson and the doctor, and they expressed their gratitude with a low bow. The doctor bent over the princess, anxiously examining her condition. Her pulse was barely beating, and its weakness caused the doctor concern. He insisted on an immediate blood test to get a full picture of her condition. A concerned Pattinson supported the idea. Suddenly, Eve, choking with indignation, exclaimed that this was already crossing all limits. Her anger was understandable. They were going to prick a man who had not recovered from the exhausting journey with a needle. The assistant saw no logic in immediately taking a blood test. Even if they took a sample, the results wouldn't be available immediately. Ivesa ordered the doctor to leave, assuring him that the examination could wait. Elizabeth, feeling weak, explained one thing: that no ordinary doctor could solve the mystery of her condition. Only her own doctor could. Who was chosen by her master. He could penetrate the depths of a complicated condition, so she insisted that rushing to check the pulse was a waste of time. Ivesa continued to be indignant, unable to contain herself, that they would so unceremoniously report everything to her master. Mrs., bowing her head, begged forgiveness for her rudeness. Elizabeth, in an imperious voice, expressed her desire that only one maid be left to her. She explained that she doesn't like having more than 2 or 3 people around her. Too many people make her uncomfortable and exhaust her. Unless, of course, this request would damage the family's reputation. The maids Pattinson had brought began to whisper among themselves, casting displeased glances. Elizabeth, with an angry expression on her face, remarked that she did not wish to repeat the same thing again, and she asked if the head maid understood everything. The lady, having disappeared, bowed her head submissively. She said quietly that they would unquestioningly carry out the will of Her Highness. Ivesa, unable to contain her anger, reproached the princess, claiming that those people were not worthy of her service, and insisted on reporting everything to the Archduke. Elizabeth, lost in thought, realized that those people were now her closest circle, but she did not feel any support from them. Besides, Mrs. Pattinson seemed too experienced and insightful. Who knew, she might want to inform the Emperor about her pregnancy. Therefore, to protect herself, the princess firmly decided that she needed to win Ivesa's favor at all costs. Elizabeth reminded the assistant of the moment when the carriage fell off a cliff, and how, risking herself, she saved her. Ivesa was full of gratitude. She could not forget the kindness. After all, without the princess, she only managed to survive with a broken arm. Then Her Highness suggested that she change masters to repay her for saving her life. Ivesa, stunned by the unexpected proposal, fell silent. The princess wasted no time in explaining that although she served her, she remained loyal to the Archduke. Elizabeth assured him that she had no intention of betraying him. She was only asking for help to protect herself within the castle walls. The princess's heart sank with anxiety. She realized that she could not forever deceive her maid, who was always by her side. Ivesa was the only one she could confide her secret to. Therefore, Her Highness decided to be frank, that in fact she was not waiting for a child. Those words sounded to the maid like a thunderclap in a cloudless sky. The silence that had reigned was broken by footsteps that were inexorably approaching. They announced the arrival of a witness. The figure of a doctor rose on the threshold, the silent keeper of the secret, who could confirm the princess's deception. Yes, that doctor was sent by the Archduke himself. Before entrusting her with such a mission, he consulted with her for a long time, describing all the circumstances in detail. The woman listened carefully and assured her that if the princess was provided with a peaceful sleep and rest, no complications would arise. So it seemed that there was no reason for alarm. After all, The shocks experienced should not have left any harmful traces. Christian asked if the doctor had conveyed his words to the princess. She had conveyed every detail as he had ordered, and everything she knew, along with his words. His face darkened when he asked about her reaction. The doctor said that a few hours ago when she was laying out the facts. Ivesa expressed deep concern for the princess's health, but the woman reassured and calmed the maid and her highness. When the half-dragon fetus develops enough and takes on human form, it will become a source of danger, as its height is an exceptional case. Most dragons despise half-bloods and dragon men, considering them monsters. After all, the mother's body is not able to withstand their strength. Even if the child is able to develop in the womb for 10 months, the mother's body will be exhausted by the power of the half-dragon growing inside. The fetus will mercilessly exhaust the mother, depriving her of all her vital energy. It will leave her no chance of surviving childbirth. As a result, the child leaves the mother's womb on its own and is born. The assistant was deeply moved. The princess remembered that this was why Christian had once warned her of the terrible death that awaited her. She was forced to accept this reality. Elizabeth, with hidden anxiety and some curiosity, asked the doctor what exactly she should pay attention to when the moment of intimacy with a half-dragon came. The woman, confused by what she heard, explained that there were certain dangers to beware of. There was a fatal day, when the dragon rage that had been dormant in their blood breaks free, forcing them to sow death and destruction among men. Perhaps this is the moment when the Archduke hastily leaves the walls of her castle. And that is when the time of the dragon's fury comes, forcing her to suddenly disappear. Their rampage will not cease until they quench their thirst with blood, or find solace in the arms of their beloved. That's why dragon people are so vulnerable to their impulses. It is also known that their passion for people knows no bounds, and they are relentless in their desires. Ivesa, unable to contain her indignation, rushed to the princess with reproaches, claiming that such a connection was madness, which carried death in itself. She begged Elizabeth to reconsider her decision, but the princess knew that there was no way back. She was not concerned with morality, but with physical compatibility. She hoped for the fearlessness of his body, and deep down she cherished the hope for a miracle. Although the doctor feared that her words would sound like the mumbling of an old woman, she felt obliged to warn the Archduke. Even though the princess was recovering, she wasn't as strong as ordinary women, so he would share a bed with her whenever he wanted. The doctor begged him to be careful and gentle. It seemed to her that her highness was far from carnal pleasures, let alone intimacy. Christian raised an eyebrow in surprise and asked about the rough hug, but the doctor resolutely rejected any hint of madness. After thinking for a moment, he said that if he hadn't known about it, he wouldn't have had so much trouble. Then, without waiting for an answer, he ordered her to leave. The Archduke decided that it was necessary to keep his distance from the princess for a while. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Mrs. Pattinson, eager to share her thoughts, entered the office. They spent time over a cup of aromatic tea, immersed in the silence of conversation. Christian reminded her of his orders to treat the princess with the same respect as he did himself, but he knew that she had secretly brought Dr. Rotiro to her chambers. Mrs., feeling guilty, bowed her head humbly, admitting her mistake and begging for forgiveness. He noticed that her shame was sincere and deep. Mrs. Pattinson, as his former nanny, felt an urgent need to share important words with him. She dreamed that his heart would find true love, that it would belong to only one woman, that he would know the happiness he deserved. Mrs. remembered a little 9-year-old boy who first crossed the threshold of the imperial castle of Benella. His gaze was empty, but within it burned a bright desire for power. For those of high rank, especially for the emperor. Pattinson noticed that his gaze, directed at the princess, was the same as he once looked at the emperor. There was a strange combination of emptiness and longing in his gaze, the same as when Christian had looked at His Majesty. So she didn't hesitate. She asked directly, did he see her as just another subject to obey, or a true life partner equal to him? Christian remained calm, answering that there could not be two versions of the truth at once. Mrs., wringing her hands gloomily, recounted what she had heard. There was gossip in the capital that the princess was to be executed by hanging, and the pregnancy was just a cunning way to avoid punishment. Her voice, though trembling, was firm as she dared to express her suspicion. Had the Duke deceived His Majesty? Although he wouldn't be able to fool her, an old, experienced woman. She fell silent, staring into his face. Pattinson asked, unable to contain her indignation or alarm, what was the real reason he had brought Her Highness to Rotiro? The Duke lowered his gaze and was silent for a moment. The woman thought there would be no answer, but finished her thought. Perhaps he was driven by envy, profit, or pity. But suddenly the man interrupted her thoughts and replied sharply that he had only done so because he had such a desire, and there would be no further explanation. Her lips tightened and her eyes dropped. Mrs. remained silent as Christian walked away, following him with a look that was a mixture of anxiety and bitter understanding. In that moment, the woman thought that the Duke, whether out of whim or something deeper, had always been drawn to people who seemed to be woven in the image of gods. But it was not a manifestation of sincere sympathy. He had an old, hidden habit of despising himself, a habit that had arisen in childhood. When little Riget stared into the mirror for a long time and saw a creature there, which was half human, half monster, and since then, as if doomed, he has been tirelessly searching for someone whose presence could give meaning to his existence. As Pattinson was about to leave, the Duke sat at the table, silent and focused. She reminded him with a slight reproach and at the same time gentleness that it would be right to sleep in one's own bedroom that night. After all, Her Highness Elizabeth was waiting there, lonely and sad. At that time the princess was sleeping soundly, curled up in bed under a heavy blanket. But suddenly something disturbed her peace. A distant voice, which came through the darkness, and called her by name, familiar and disturbing. She opened her eyes and Andrei stood before her. His face was worn, battered, distorted with pain. Elizabeth looked back at him in horror and asked what had happened. Where was his eye? But instead of answering, his brother began to speak of her with anxiety, indignation, and despair. Her appearance, condition, and choice troubled him. He abruptly interrupted his sister's attempt to explain something, and unable to contain his indignation, reminded her that she was the Princess of Argana. And how could she dare to do such a thing? How could she allow it, to get pregnant by Christian? His words hit like a whip. Elizabeth trembled. Tears welled up in her eyes. She lowered her head and whispered that she had no choice. She had to survive. However, her brother didn't listen, interrupted her and said that she should have escaped from Rotiro first. The princess wanted to say something to stop him, but Andrei turned away, silently moved away. She reached out her hand, called out, but he disappeared into the darkness. Suddenly everything came to a halt. Elizabeth woke up gasping for breath, her body trembling, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. It was just a dream, but after it a pain remained in my chest, deep, silent, like the mark of a wound that doesn't bleed but doesn't heal. Waking up, Her Highness slowly stood up and remembered that during the entire journey to Rotiro, he had never appeared in her dreams. Her gaze involuntarily stopped at the empty space next to her, where Christian should have been lying. She silently stared into the folds of the bed, realizing that he hadn't come last night either. A week had passed since she arrived in Rotiro, including the journey. It had been almost a month since their agreement. His words still echoed in her memory, but they sounded like an empty echo. Clutching the sheet with her fingers, Elizabeth felt a quiet, restrained resentment wash over her, a promise that would never be kept. She remained alone in the room, silent and motionless, like an exile in a foreign space that had once seemed like the promise of a new life. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the ringing voice of the assistant. She, entering, hastened to remind him that the morning air was still cool, and she politely asked the lady to throw her cloak over her. Mrs. Pattinson entered after her, accompanied by several maids. She bowed low to Her Highness and asked if the princess had slept well. Elizabeth replied that thanks to her care the night had passed peacefully. The lady hurriedly ordered one of the assistants to bring a scarf. The girl, apologizing, hurried towards the exit, asking to wait a moment. The princess followed her with her gaze, then turned her eyes to another maid. At that moment, she noticed for the first time how many beautiful women Rotiro had. Each of them had their own beauty, a grace that was hard not to notice. Her thoughts were interrupted by Pattinson's calm voice. She politely asked if Her Highness needed anything else. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment before answering. And then, as if by chance, with barely perceptible curiosity, she asked, "Was the lady personally involved in the selection of everyone who served in the castle at that time?" The woman nodded cautiously, explaining that she and the butler were responsible for recruiting staff. If the princess needed a list, it could easily be prepared. However, she added that some people had been sent not by them, but by His Majesty himself. This message surprised Elizabeth. It seemed unusual to her that the emperor would intervene in such matters on his own. But Pattinson's next words came as a complete surprise. She clarified that His Majesty sent not just servants to the castle, but candidates for the title of Archduchess. The princess froze at what she heard. The words pierced her like an icy wind. She stood motionless, as if the world around her had suddenly stopped. The princess, fragile and dreamy, was wearing a thin shirt with a shawl draped over her shoulders. She was leisurely descending the steep stairs. The memory of Pattinson's words echoed in her mind. The Lord sent not servants to the castle, but candidates for the title of Archduchess. His heart beat anxiously and unevenly. His Majesty was paying excessive attention to the Duke's future marriage. And then that attention seemed suspicious. With a frown, Elizabeth remembered how the lady had carefully explained that some of the women had been sent by the imperial family itself. So she had no choice but to accept them as servants. But behind that formality, Her Highness felt something deeper and more uneasy. After all, dragonmen were known for their passion for carnal pleasures. And perhaps among those women was one who had become too close to him. Rigette, looking intently and somewhat grimly at one of the maids, asked if the princess had really gone to the office alone. The girl timidly confirmed that Her Highness had insisted that she wanted to go unaccompanied. She was so determined that they could not stop her. And the anxious assistant apologized for that. Sighing heavily, the Duke realized that something was bothering the princess. The maid cautiously added that the lady seemed to have trouble sleeping. She often suffered from nightmares at night. That news surprised Christian. During the entire journey to Rotiro, nothing like this had happened. The girl, a little dazed, also noticed that the princess was restless, sleeping alone. The Duke looked at her in surprise. Thinking about her words, Ivesa added. He had always been by her side on the road, and it had been a week since they had arrived in Rotiro. Maybe the princess just needed some time to get used to it. Or maybe she needed the warmth of her husband. Rigette turned around with an unexpected lightness in his gaze, and wondered if Her Highness had really said that. The assistant, visibly perking up, explained that when the Duke was next to the princess, it was easy to sense that her behavior changed. That was why Eve advised the Duke to go to the study immediately. Her mistress went to look for him there, although they apparently missed each other. Christian lowered his eyes silently, thoughtful. Something in her words touched him, and in a moment he was listening intently to the details. The assistant happily pointed to the door through which the princess had gone. This surprised the man. He did not immediately understand which door she was referring to. Then the girl clarified. What she meant was the narrow, inconspicuous stairs that led from the bedroom directly to his office. It was down these that Elizabeth went. Rigette tensed sharply. Realizing that the princess had traveled that dangerous route on her own, his gaze became hard, alarming. He looked closely at the maid, weighing the situation. She only smiled softly, as if assuring him that nothing terrible had happened. In the silence of the stable, amidst the smell of hay and the warmth of the horses, Elizabeth thanked Sir Reuben for his help. If it hadn't been for him, she would still be stuck on those narrow stairs. The boy, scratching the back of his head in embarrassment, noticed that the door to the office was obviously locked. After all, no one had used that entrance for a long time. He could not have imagined that such a delicate lady would start knocking on the door so vigorously. The princess denied that she had knocked only lightly, almost delicately. But Sir Reuben had warned her that the stairs were dangerous, and she shouldn't walk them alone. They were too steep and slippery. If anything happened to her, the Duke would be alarmed. However, a quiet, sad voice answered. Her Highness expressed doubt. Would Christian really be worried? His cold indifference became more and more noticeable to her, like a shadow hanging over their every encounter. The guy couldn't contain his indignation. How could the gentleman remain so cold with her, when in fact he showed her so much warmth and tenderness? It's just that the princess didn't see what he was like with the knights. A true half-dragon whose fury sent shivers down his spine every time he lost his patience. A small mistake was enough, and the consequences could be fatal. But with her, Christian was, in his opinion, as soft as a ripe peach. The princess herself thought otherwise. All the peach pits had dried up long ago. Without answering anything, she turned her gaze to the big black horse. He stood aside, and Elizabeth slowly approached him. Touching his shiny fur, she stroked him tenderly, which was more like a need to be heard than simple curiosity. Sir warned that it was better not to touch that horse. It was dangerous and not used to being handled by strangers. But Elizabeth, as if not hearing him, continued to speak gently to the animal. She asked how he was doing, nuzzled his broad nose, and hugged him. There was a soft irony in her voice. Despite its formidable appearance, the horse turned out to be surprisingly gentle and calmly carried the strangers on its back, offering no resistance. The princess immediately asked what the name of this unusual creature was. But Reuben replied that the master had not yet given him one. Drawing her cheek to the horse's powerful forehead, she remarked with slight indignation that his master was heartless and called him churnish. He kept stroking its shiny, muscle-tight skin. The sir was amazed, but the animal had always been unruly and wild. The only one who could subdue him was the Archduke, and the fact that the horse allowed such liberties to the princess seemed almost impossible. She had no idea of this and was genuinely surprised. Still addressing Reuben, Her Highness thoughtfully remarked that her attempts to find the owner had yielded no good results. She was increasingly upset that her search had ended in nothing. Then the boy cautiously suggested a walk around the castle if the princess was bored. But she suddenly asked, could she borrow a horse? She wanted to ride around the yard a little. Sir generously allowed her to choose any of the horses. But Elizabeth's choice fell on Churnish. She asked if he could carry her on his back, and the horse snorted loudly in response, as if smiling in its own way. Suddenly a low, hoarse voice sounded behind her, in which one could hear restrained anxiety. The voice remarked that it was dangerous for a pregnant woman to saddle a horse alone, especially one like that. Elizabeth turned slightly, and she saw Réger's hand reach out to her. He gently touched the princess's shoulder, noting that she was standing too close to the war stallion, and not hiding his excitement, he hugged her by the shoulders, firmly but gently, as if he wanted to protect her from the whole world. She turned away from the Duke, clutching the shawl around her shoulders, and with bitter calmness she noted that the world was full of dangers. He said that was the case for her, and he wondered if she had really been walking around the castle in her nightgown all that time. Elizabeth shrugged her shoulders awkwardly, and she replied that she had met almost no one. And on the way to Rotiro, the knights had also seen her in simple monastic clothes. At the time, it seemed natural. Réger, maintaining a reserved respect, addressed her with official politeness, asking her to wear such clothes only in his presence, or in front of the maids who tended her in the bedroom. Others, he said, should not see Her Highness in this form. The princess clutched his cloak to her chest, feeling mixed emotions, embarrassment, resentment, sadness. She denied that it mattered. Even he had never seen her dressed like this before. Elizabeth's voice was drowned in silence as she looked away and added, almost in a whisper, that the Duke was so busy that he didn't have time for even one visit during the day. Christian looked at her longer than usual, and somehow differently he came closer. His fingers gently touched her lips. He asked the princess not to bite them, saying it hurt just as much. Their closeness was quiet, almost tense. Behind that scene, eyes downcast, stood Reuben, feeling superfluous. Turning away, Her Highness quietly remarked that whatever it was, he had behaved too harshly. She comes and calls her thoughtless. It was as if she didn't realize her own mistakes. She was ashamed of herself anyway. But there was no answer. Instead, Christian suddenly picked her up in his arms and gave Reuben a heavy, stern look, ordering her to come to him later, separately, in his office. The alarmed sir only nodded silently. Elizabeth, surprised and indignant, tried to stop him. She said that the boy was only seeing her off, but the Duke said nothing. She began to notice that he always kept quiet when he did not want to answer. Silence was his best defense. Reuben, left alone, looked them over. He muttered quietly to himself that they really did look like a married couple. In her chambers, the princess did not understand the reason for his anger. The husband carefully laid her on the bed, and she, unable to contain her irritation, continued. If he doesn't like her leaving the bedroom, then maybe he should show up more often himself. Then she won't have the desire to look for him. Her words were calm, but behind them was pain. Her Highness reminded her why she was there in the first place. A pact had been made between them, and that they should finally fulfill his conditions. Instead, Christian looked away, answering with restraint that he didn't want to do that right then. Elizabeth frowned slightly and looked at him silently, a look that held more than any words could say. A sharp, almost painful realization struck the princess. Of course he didn't want to, because he had plenty of other options besides her. Images of young, beautiful maids filling the castle corridors once again appeared before my eyes, and that thought so struck her that she suddenly got out of bed. And she firmly declared that she had no intention of sitting idle, waiting in vain for him. As she prepared to leave, she announced that she would ask Reuben to show her the castle. The Duke had no time to respond when she firmly ordered him to give way. Looking at Her Highness, he suddenly understood. In that short scene, the princess was trying to say something more. Her gesture was a protest, a kind of sentence. If there was no real intimacy between them, then there was no point in their being together either. Riget slowly approached. He touched her shoulder with a hand that radiated warmth and strength, and quietly said that he understood what she expected of him. But there was no ease in that. He had always been disgusted by the merging of bodies that took place without any real connection. Mechanical, animalistic, devoid of meaning. The kind of thing that creatures driven only by instinct did. Carefully, almost respectfully, he set her down on the bed and continued, not looking her in the eye, that he was born as he was, a monster who lost his mother early. His kind, blind in their lust, never thought of those around them. Their nature was even worse than that of a beast. His own nature was almost the same. So the Duke tried to stay away. From her, from temptation, from himself. The man thought he could cool down if he saw Elizabeth as little as possible. But everything turned out differently. His hand gently touched the princess's face, where her fair curls fell gently. Her eyes were filled with a quiet appeal. Her Highness wanted to say something, but Christian remained silent. Silence, as always, remained his only response. He desired her with the same intensity as he had 3 years ago when he first saw her. The achingly beautiful creature that still lived in his memory, which seemed to shine a light amidst the darkness of his life, like a precious thing that accidentally fell into his hands, even if only for a short time. He sought to keep that fragile, radiant essence intact. Pattinson's words echoed in his head, whether it was for benefit or pity. Suddenly he admitted that she was right about something. A faint smile touched his lips, and he finally said what he had long wanted to say. And he suggested postponing the terms of their union until they got to know each other a little better. Elizabeth looked at him in comprehension. A surprised gleam appeared in her eyes. It was as if she had not immediately realized that the Duke was trying to get closer. Christian confirmed her guess and asked how long it would take her. Without hesitation, she replied that it all depended on him. The Duke had to make an effort because he avoided Elizabeth, hiding behind silence, and when she sought him out, he responded only with anger. Her words left an impression on him. Looking at her, he remembered something. Stretching out his hand, he unexpectedly offered it to her. The next day, go together to the festival, in the square outside the castle. At that moment, Riget dropped to one knee and silently waited for an answer. The night enveloped the princess's bedroom in deep darkness, through which the soft silver of moonlight streamed. Christian sat by the bed, silently staring into her face, lost in his own thoughts. He remembered the moment he had asked her to go to the festival, and how she, a little confused but still agreed. I also remembered their contract, signed, sealed, and binding. From then on, he couldn't avoid that closeness. He just had to take his time, not pressurize, and let everything unfold gradually. Elizabeth was sleeping deeply, like a child lost in dreams. But suddenly her body tensed, her lips whispered someone's name. He thought it was Andri. She was muttering something, asking him to wait, as if trying to hold back the one who was disappearing. And then her voice became desperate. It seemed as if someone from her dream was begging her to run away. Rotiro was no place for her. Christian, worried, leaned closer. And suddenly her body began to glow with a gentle, barely noticeable glow. His hand touched one of the curls and it too shone in his fingers. The Duke froze. What was happening before him defied explanation. He didn't understand what it was. He just felt something strange, dangerous, and at the same time thrilling, awakening in her at that very moment. The day of the festival had arrived. The streets outside the castle were bustling with life, the air filled with the aromas of spices, hot pastries, and the dust of a great fair. People laughed, traded, sang, colorful ribbons fluttered above their heads. And it seemed that the very wind was saturated with festivity. The princess felt unusually light. The northern summer was pleasantly cool, which made the day even more pleasant. They walked together, hidden in the shadows of their hoods. Christian, watching her closely, tried to understand what it was that had caused her such genuine joy. She smiled and admitted that even in her heavy cloak she didn't feel the heat. On the contrary, she was happy to be able to walk. Regatta was surprised that such a walk was something new for her. Elizabeth, as if a little embarrassed, explained. Whenever she lingered too long in the open air, Andri would appear. His brother always protected her, believing that it was dangerous for her to walk around on the ground too much. He would pick her up, and she still remembered how disappointed she had been when he didn't. Christian was silent. But there was a new tacit recognition in his gaze that the day had been important to her, and perhaps it would become important to him too. Among the bustling festive crowd, Elizabeth saw something, and without thinking she addressed him as Sir. But before she could finish, Christian gently placed his hands on her shoulders, stopping her. Surprise flashed in her eyes. She didn't immediately understand what he wanted. His voice was quiet as he asked the princess to call him by his first name. The title, they said, drew too much attention. Her Highness was embarrassed. It seemed strange to her that someone who was so eager to remain unnoticed did not even hide his own name. Her gaze involuntarily stopped on him, and she asked who gave him the name. The man answered briefly, His Majesty. That piqued her curiosity. After all, she knew that he had entered the palace at 9, so who he was and what his name was before was unknown. He was ahead of her for a moment, took a few steps forward. Then he stopped and answered without looking back. Even in those years, almost no one called him by his name. Life before that had been such that he didn't need a name. After a short silence, Elizabeth cautiously said, Regit. His shoulders tensed slightly and he slowly looked around. There was something shaky, almost trusting in her voice. The princess added that she herself would like him to address her simply by her first name. After the death of her parents, only her brother called her that. Christian listened attentively without interrupting. Then he asked what the emperor called her Argana. Her Highness thought for a moment, and then she said quietly that most of the time they called her Eliza. But when they were alone, he addressed her affectionately as Lisa. Someone in the crowd accidentally pushed the princess in the shoulder. Regit instantly placed his hand on her back. That protective gesture that had nothing ostentatious about it. Elizabeth admitted that she almost never left the palace, so André often visited her in her room. She glanced around. So many people, so much noise, the air filled with the aromas of food and flowers. And all of it was a stark contrast to her past. Christian was surprised to hear that she was forbidden to go out. That circumstance alarmed him. It seemed that she was deliberately kept under lock and key. From the beginning, he had sensed in her a strange, not princess, power that did not belong to her. And it seemed that only one person could dare to impose such signs. She broke away from her thoughts and approached the counter, behind which stood a woman with baskets of fragrant herbs and sweets. And suddenly she heard Christian calling her by her title. The princess immediately looked around and sternly corrected him. Eliza. The man quickly corrected himself, trying to change the subject, and asked how she felt at that moment compared to life in Argan. The princess thought for a moment. The answer surprised even her. She felt better. But the feeling of guilt did not disappear. Her body struggled for life, but her soul was tormented by the thought of her brother's death. Her Highness was to blame for his absence. If that was the case, something in common had re-emerged between her and Christian. She said this calmly, meeting his heavy, searching gaze. Approaching one of the counters, Elizabeth noticed large containers of berries. She asked about cherry jam. The Duke, watching her, thought that her health seemed to have begun to recover after the death of the Emperor. The strange relationship between the Emperor and the princess flashed through his memory, and Ugel's disturbing arrow aimed at her, as if there was something unspoken behind it. His words surfaced, warning Christian to be careful, because the cunning fox would drink everything he could out of him and disappear like that vile emperor. That unsettling thought made the Duke look at events in a new way. Was the Emperor of Argana still alive? The maids in the manor were whispering to each other. It was as if the Duke and Princess had developed a new intimacy since they had returned from the festival. One of them cautiously suggested that their mutuality had become more obvious, especially after the news of Her Highness's pregnancy. Another agreed, noting that even though they were a couple, such a change in behavior seemed too sudden. They began to have breakfast together, lingering for a long time in the Duke's office. This caused surprise and sometimes delight among the staff. In the living room, sipping tea, Elizabeth glanced at Christian, who was intently jotting down something in a small notebook. She cautiously broached the subject, asking if they had become closer. He silently agreed without looking up. His restraint ignited irritation in her. Silently watching her husband, she remembered Pattinson's words that her condition would soon become noticeable. Even though her belly wasn't round yet, Mrs. insisted on the tailor, that it was time to take measurements and sew the dresses in advance. Elizabeth sighed. Sometimes it seemed that if he had just held her for a moment, she would have stopped looking for confirmation in his silence. But instead, she increasingly found herself thinking that she would have to be the first to make a move. Otherwise, the distance between them would remain insurmountable. Her thoughts were interrupted by the Duke's unexpected voice. Low, reserved, but too close to leave her indifferent. Her Highness shuddered, not expecting to hear him at that moment. Christian noted that she was probably having nightmares again. The maids reported that she couldn't even eat a proper breakfast. Her face was pale and haggard. A suspicion flashed through him. Perhaps the Emperor was dreaming again. He remembered the day when her condition had suddenly improved, as if something had left her body. The magic that had been gripping her from within seemed to have come out, but there was no trace left on her body. Nothing to indicate interference or curse, and yet that invisibility was alarming. The Duke coldly considered the idea that if nothing was visible, perhaps he would have to examine her body more closely, even if it all required taking off her clothes, to reveal what had remained hidden from view until then. The princess suggested with a bitter smile that perhaps it was all because of her decision to explore the castle on her own and the walk with Sir Reuben. The mention of the numerous beautiful women who came across him at every turn escaped her lips as if in passing, but behind it lay a painful question. She asked if that was why he was avoiding her. The man was silent for a long time before answering. He did not talk about the others, but only added that in front of him at that moment sat the most beautiful of them all. But that didn't calm her down. She just sighed, shook her head, and spoke softly, that there was no point in pretending again that nothing had happened. Because of that deceit, she couldn't even properly tell him what she was keeping inside. Her Highness knew that the Duke understood. For her, the question was not a whim, but a matter of life and death. But perhaps he himself secretly desired her. Taking a step closer, Elizabeth remembered how he had said he didn't want to hug someone like her. But then he had acted completely differently, and then he avoided her again. Promised her, but never fulfilled it. Coming very close, she grabbed his shirt and looked up at him with a penetrating gaze. Her golden eyes burned with conviction as she demanded the truth. The princess wanted to know if Christian had truly never desired her. He was silent, just watching. And at that moment she hugged him, whispering that all this silence was a clear violation of their agreement. The man calmly asked what she meant. Elizabeth, not holding back her emotions, reminded him that there was an agreement, a bargain between them, according to which, under certain conditions, they had to fulfill their duty. And then, raising her voice, she asked what exactly those conditions should be. Her Highness began to be irritated by his vague reasoning, that they should become closer first. His silence, his calmness, only fueled the princess's anger. And at one point she really did remind Rajette of an angry rabbit. A touching but stubborn creature who was not going to give in. Eventually, having calmed down, she lowered her eyes and confessed. It's not that she's against intimacy. It's just that everything will become obvious to others very soon. So there's no point in delaying. Leaning closer, Elizabeth felt his indifferent immobility, his coldness, and in that silence it seemed to her that all that remained was to take the initiative. Christian stubbornly addressed her formally, which only emphasized the distance between them. Elizabeth gently but persistently asked him not to do that. She longed for closeness and warmth. The princess did not want whatever might happen between them to happen to a man to whom she was indifferent. Elizabeth understood that some people were willing to do such things for the sake of profit. But looking at him, she admitted that she liked him. Her Highness's voice trembled, and the gaze that met his silent, passionate silence quickly dropped. She was about to leave. The tailor was due to arrive soon, and this conversation was becoming too disturbing. But in an instant, her movement stopped. The Duke suddenly threw her onto the table. The teacup tipped over, and a thin porcelain sound shattered the silence of the room. His hands were tightly gripping her wrists, his face hovering very close. The princess shuddered from surprise, from his passionate gaze, from the way Regette's breath touched her cheek, and his arms tightly wrapped around her waist. His voice cut through the space between them. Dull, muffled, almost inauthentic. He couldn't even imagine what she might like. Moving seductively and decisively, Christian reached for her dress and began to undo the buttons. She froze, as if waiting for an explanation. He didn't need words. His lips barely touched her neck. What remained hidden was about to yield to a condition that could not be avoided. The room was filled with muffled voices and breaths. Everything that could be borne between two hearts that had waited too long. Another cup fell, shattering on the floor, unable to withstand the tension of the moment. The princess begged to be given a little time. His lips greedily sought her skin, and his fingers, gliding along her back, stumbled upon something. A magic circle on her left shoulder blade. Not the only one, it seemed. The touch stirred mixed feelings in him. Even if it was her brother's sign, something in him felt uneasy. The princess whispered his name, asking him not to stop, to come closer. The Duke was surprised, but he didn't stop. Furniture swayed around them. Things fell to the ground. But Christian continued to bite into her neck, touch her body with his lips, hug her, as if afraid of losing her again. But suddenly everything changed. His terrible hand suddenly appeared in a blue glow. Magic chains bound it like a warning. Confused, Elizabeth quietly said his name, not understanding why the man had suddenly pulled away so abruptly. The primal power hidden within his body was breaking the boundaries of humanity. The dragon hidden beneath his skin yearned for freedom, and every moment of loss of control brought danger closer. Riget stared at her, a sudden realization dawning on him. He couldn't let his power threaten that fragile, trusting body. Christian cautiously asked if she was okay. The princess nodded in the affirmative, although she didn't understand why he had suddenly stopped. But in response, the man only said that he seemed to have found that very inevitable condition. She wanted to know what exactly he meant, but there was only silence in response. His gaze slid down her neck, where the traces of his touch were visible. And then, as if trying to change the subject, he noted that Her Highness should gain another 20 pounds. That, in his opinion, would be enough. But she was stunned by what she heard. Later, in her own chambers, the princess sat in a warm bath. She was assisted by Ivesa, who noticed the marks on Her Highness's body. The spots were getting darker and darker, and it looked like they would soon turn into bruises. But Elizabeth just brushed them off. The main thing was that nothing was broken. In the silence, she returned to her thoughts about the Duke. Something made him stop. Perhaps it was the dragon's uncontrolled rage, like the wild seed of Semisit, bursting forth from the seal of power hidden within his body. And those 20 pounds. She couldn't help but wonder if she would even be able to gain that much. Ivesa, sighing anxiously, insisted on calling a doctor. The girl asked the princess to wait a little, at least until the court healer arrived. But Elizabeth only smiled slightly, assuring her that she would not die from such a thing. Because the blood of the dragon cannot harm the descendants of Gallion. It was not just a belief, but an ancient vow, made between teacher and student, or between lovers. Sitting in the bathtub, hugging her knees, the princess stared into the water for a long time. She remembered Christian and those old promises that still lived in her blood. In the kingdom of Ugel, their commander, the first Prince Rihan Sihat, raged. His anger was uncontrollable. A heavy fist pounded on the oak table, and a voice broke the silence. He shouted that the twin freaks were equal in their cunning and ability to disappear without a trace. Turning to the third prince, Hanan, the man demanded an explanation. The pale-faced prince reported that the emperor had disappeared, despite the fact that his tendons were torn and his eye gouged out, and whispered that he shouldn't be among the living. Rihan sighed and said that they needed the dragon to gain its power, and the only way to lure the emperor was to capture the princess as bait. He said angrily that the fool had somehow incurred Benella's wrath. Why did he have to climb into the dragon's den? Hanan turned to his brother with a proposal to dispel false rumors. When asked what exactly, he answered in the affirmative, that the princess had magic and was hiding something important. Rihan thought about it, admitting that there might be a grain of truth to that. Tapping his finger on the table, he spoke thoughtfully. Why did the emperor protect his sister so carefully? Rihan made an instant decision. Spread the rumor that the princess had escaped from the Duke with the help of magic, but was caught by him. And he added that if Hanan turns out to be right, even the fugitive emperor will believe those rumors and will not stay away. While his sister is a symbol of hope, for which he risked his life, who suffered from cruelty on his part. Clenching his fist, he firmly declared that within a year the brother and sister would have to submit and bow to Ugel, and he laughed ominously. On a sunny morning, the manor's dining room was filled with the clanking sounds of cutlery. One of the maids silently served the table with treats. Everything was as the Duke had ordered. Desserts, sweets, cakes. The table was bending under their weight. Christian, without looking up from his book, curtly ordered the dishes to be left and the servants to leave. The maids bowed and left the hall. The man, flipping through the pages, gave her a stern look. He wanted Eliza to stop just looking at the desserts and finally taste something. After that, she was told she could go to her room. Touching the edge of her plate with her finger, the princess timidly offered to eat together. But Riget, without looking up, refused curtly. Sweets were not for him. When she raised a piece of dessert to her lips, her voice sounded firm. Her Highness asked what he liked, for she had the impression that everything that concerned her only irritated him, and she said in despair that if he didn't like her, then the Duke should say so. She chewed carefully, savoring the incredible combination of flavors, and at that very moment, Christian furtively glanced at her from the side. His gaze lingered briefly on her lips, and a faint smile flickered across her lips. They sat across from each other at a long table. Desserts, silence, and something indescribable in common united them in that silent breakfast. In the evening, wrapped in a light nightgown, Elizabeth sat on the floor in front of the mirror and carefully stared at her own reflection. Around her were scattered sheets of paper with drawings on them. Each one clearly depicted intricate magic circles. She slowly ran her fingers over one of them, frozen in silence for a moment. Her gaze lingered on the patterns, the same ones that adorned her body. On his left forearm, on his ankle, along his spine. These were the same marks that Andri had worked on with such dedication. But the princess still did not know what power he had placed in them. In a deep sigh, a confession was made. No matter how much she searched, she could not find an explanation. It was probably Semicita magic, ancient knowledge restricted to the chosen few, which she trusted only to Galen. One of the circles on the paper suddenly lit up, a soft glow cutting through the twilight. Elizabeth opened her eyes wide. She didn't understand what had triggered it. It could have been her touch, an echo of will, or even Semicity's voice traveling through time. At that moment, a slight tremor ran through her Highness's body. One of the symbols on her back also began to glow. She looked around, amazed, feeling the pulsation of the power that was awakening within her. Her body seemed to be part of an ancient magical scheme. In the name of the dragon, perhaps the last curtain was lifted. Standing before the mirror was not just a princess, but the heiress of the power that lived within her. Despite the fact that Semicita swallowed up half a continent and took the lives of hundreds of thousands of innocent people, she was unable to destroy a single Galleon, the disciple who disowned her. Refusing revenge, she placed a curse on him. Her name would be a shadow that would haunt him until his last breath. On the day of the breakup, Semicita said that every time he turned to his own strength, he would be forced to remember the name of his mentor, for none of them were destined to be free from each other. Elizabeth, bending over the sheets of magic circles, studied their geometry thoughtfully. If the dragon couldn't destroy Galleon, and he hadn't forgotten her, perhaps there's something more hidden in that connection. She wondered if it was worth following that particular circle. If she could master magic, perhaps her fate would change and she wouldn't have to give birth to a child. That thought flashed through her mind like a spark, that her Highness could use force not to submit but to escape. Looking at herself in the mirror, Elizabeth noticed a change. She seemed to have gained some weight. That should have been enough. Her fingers slid along her waistline, her thoughts flowing out loud. If she broke in, she would be kicked out at dawn. The door creaked, but the princess didn't hear it. Her voice remained quiet, almost involuntary. And then Reget's familiar voice sounded from behind, calm, but with a faint hint of surprise. He asked who she meant. In response, he heard that she was talking about herself. However, he did not understand why and who exactly was supposed to expel her. The princess shuddered, as if frozen in motion. The man slowly pulled on his gloves. Then Christian came closer, silently, and threw the shawl over her shoulders almost ceremoniously as befits her Highness. Surprised by the Duke's unexpected appearance, Elizabeth turned away sharply, trying to hide the emotions that flashed across her face. Her voice, though restrained, did not hide the tension. She wondered what had caused him to appear in her chambers uninvited. Reget, not meeting her gaze, only lowered his head and cautiously remarked, "Did she really intend to be so cold with him?" Looking back, the princess firmly objected. After all, he could see perfectly well what she was doing, so he himself deliberately violated her space. Her Majesty's voice was confident. Everything looked exactly as she said it would. She had no intention of hiding anything, although she had no plans to expose herself. But at that moment, another thought occurred to Elizabeth. Perhaps it would even be appropriate. She took a smooth step toward him, not hiding her smile, in which a subtle irony appeared. Her voice took on playful intonations. The princess slowly removed the shawl from her shoulders and, as if by chance, remarked, "Maybe it was time to check if she had gained weight." Coming closer, she put her arm around his shoulders and whispered that Christian should see for himself. Reget silently reached out, wrapped her in a shawl, and quietly remarked that he didn't have to check everything himself. The doctor was sending her medical records. Elizabeth froze, bewildered. And then with a bitter smile she said that even her weight was in those reports. Her gaze slowly blurred with tears. She turned away and said he was a terrible person. She realized with painful clarity that with his behavior like this, nothing would ever happen between them. But suddenly the Duke took off his jacket and threw it over her shoulders. She said in surprise that she had not expected how that simple act could warm her heart. The man slowly leaned towards her, gently touching the delicate skin on her neck with his lips, and quietly begged her not to hold grudges. But Elizabeth, though confused, replied that her emotions didn't matter to him. He wouldn't change anyway. Christian was silent before approaching her and quietly saying that he would be leaving the estate for a while. And it was at that moment that Elizabeth understood everything. His gentleness that day was not accidental. Behind it was news he did not want to tell her. She tried to find out the reason. The Duke explained that his half-draconic instability recurred every 4 months, and during that time, he couldn't be near her. He promised that he would disappear for no longer than 10 days. The princess immediately remembered his promise. The husband was to fulfill the request as soon as she regained her strength. But when he touched her hair, he said calmly, "As everyone knows perfectly well, gaining 20 pounds in a short time is simply impossible." In parting, Christian asked Her Highness to take care of herself, to eat well, get enough sleep, and not to overexert herself. And if you ever wanted to leave the castle, you had to cover your face as before, and definitely take someone with you. The princess was painfully aware that the man she had let into her heart was once again breaking his promises, once again giving her the hope he himself had taken away. Outwardly, Elizabeth remained calm, pretending not to be affected, but deep down despair was growing. If things continue in this vein, we'll have to find another way. She remembered the magic circles she had, and lowering her head, admitted. Despite the realization, the princess still did nothing. With the thought that she might not be able to leave in the fall, her heart quickened, gripped by an anxious foreboding. Her thoughts were interrupted by the Duke's voice, who addressed her formally. Her Highness replied with restraint that if he was not sincere in the fall, there was no point in pretending tenderness then. At first, Regat did not understand Her Highness's words. But then, filled with pain and irritation, she reminded him of his own words, that the princess was naive, unfamiliar with the cruelty of the world, and could easily succumb to illusions and deception. Elizabeth thought that if she just showed her a small glimmer of kindness, her whole world would immediately take on that hue. She complained that he seemed to forget about their contract, and if it weren't for her, the Emperor would have been reminding him about the heir for years. The Duke, bowing his head, listened silently, embarrassed, not daring to interrupt. Her Highness continued that it wasn't just about her life. She wanted to help him in any way she could. With a blush on her cheeks, she admitted that she wanted to know more about him. Lisa's words struck him. Christian asked again, but she, bowing her head, gently hinted not to pretend she hadn't heard. Taking his hand, she gently ignited warmth in it, and asked him to return as soon as possible and keep his promises. The Duke thought that the woman was not a rabbit but a cunning fox. Taking his hand firmly, she reminded him that without him she had no place in Rotiro. It didn't matter to him who she really was. A princess created to enchant and who had power over his heart. Looking into his eyes and holding his hands, Elizabeth asked him to be careful. Regat agreed and promised to return soon. 2 days had passed since Christian had left. In the silence of the drawing room, the princess turned to Ivesa and asked if anyone had come. The maid, suppressing her excitement, announced that a lady from the Duke's family, Irene, had arrived by order of the Emperor. Rotiro's uninvited guest was a red-haired lady. She was calmly drinking tea in the living room, as if she were the mistress of the house. Miss exclaimed enthusiastically as the princess and Pattinson came out to meet her. With a bright smile, she said that she had finally met her mistress. She called herself Zenobia Irene, but in her voice, in her manners, in her whole tone, Elizabeth caught not a shadow of true courtesy. In the presence of the uninvited guest, a cold superiority hovered, skillfully hidden behind a refined, almost feigned politeness. The princess recalled how, even earlier upon hearing of the Miss's arrival, she had expressed no desire to see her. But Pattinson insisted. Because the girl had arrived on the direct orders of His Majesty, and she could not be refused admission. Elizabeth was surprised and had not even heard of her before. Later, the lady explained that Zenobia was 23, the only daughter of a duke, a close ally of the emperor. For several years, the ruler had persistently recommended her as a worthy candidate for the title of Archduchess. The news stunned the princess. But what was even more surprising was that, despite Regit's constant refusals, the Miss did not stop visiting Rotiro. Her trips became almost an annual tradition. Under the roof of the castle, the princess said, the Duke had enough women without it. Her words caused Pattinson a slight surprise. But Elizabeth only reminded him of what the lady herself had said earlier. The women sent by the Emperor to the Archduke remained in the castle as servants. Pattinson paused, then noted that Her Highness seemed to be continuing to torment herself, repeatedly taking on the label of the Duchess's shadow. The princess was at a loss for words. No answer could be found. Only silence froze on her lips. But the woman did not stop. Her voice was even, calm, almost detached. Whatever Elizabeth's thoughts about herself, the truth should not be despised. She was a duchess, a title that gave her power worthy of the Archduke himself. Her power was as great as his, and that was an undeniable fact. Irene repeated with a polite smile that she was pleased to meet you. But there was no answer. A shadow of irritation flickered in her gaze. Perhaps the princess's silence was due to herself, her title. Mrs. Suggestion caused Pattinson a slight surprise. Elizabeth, having recovered, replied with restraint that she was also pleased to meet him. However, the lack of proper greeting did not go unnoticed. Irene frowned noticeably. In response, the princess announced her title with cold politeness and formally welcomed her to Rotiro. Sitting on the couch opposite the princess, Irene carried herself confidently, not hiding her superiority. Pattinson stood silently next to her. The red-haired guest remarked that it was necessary to observe the rules of etiquette adopted in Benella. However, the presence of Her Highness seemed inexperienced to her. Almost naive, like a blank slate. The fact that Elizabeth did not rise when she appeared she interpreted as a demonstrative attempt to disregard ceremony. Passing her hand over her forehead, Irene noted with feigned admiration that the princess was a very interesting person. The lady, maintaining a respectful posture, bowed and explained in a reserved manner that Her Highness was just getting used to her new surroundings. And she noted that according to Benella's protocol, the princess's actions were impeccable. Irene, recognizing this, agreed to speak with her as equals. With a sharp movement, she threw a letter with the imperial seal onto the table and announced that it contained an order from His Majesty. In connection with the absence of the Duke, the princess had the right to examine him. The guest calmly declared that she would remain in Rotiro. Until an official answer is received, she is obliged to stay. Standing up, she asked Pattinson to prepare her usual room. The woman bowed and replied that she had given the appropriate orders, and then they left the living room. Elizabeth slowly took the letter in her hands. Her gaze was clouded with some inner anxiety. As she stared at the seal, she hesitated whether to read it. In Reget's office, the princess was studying the financial report and trying to figure out the reason for the discrepancies in the data. Her attention was drawn to a noticeable difference in the amount of the autumn tribute that Rotiro was transferring to the imperial castle of Benella. That amount was significantly different from previous years, and Her Highness received those who were responsible for those shipments. Sober immediately objected. This was impossible. The Archduke was at the front in the fall, and that is why the reporting was handled with increased attention. Alfredo, the butler, joined the conversation. He confirmed that the accounting report had been carefully prepared and sent to the Duke, and if Christian had checked it himself, then where did the discrepancy come from? The princess could not find an explanation. The aide suggested that some of the tribute might have been stolen during transport to Benella. Elizabeth admitted that this was quite likely. Such issues should be resolved within the system itself. Therefore, a deep and careful investigation was necessary. Pattinson reminded us that the managers were the Duke's men and therefore trustworthy. So it was logical to start the check with the newcomers. Her Highness carefully reviewed the papers again and reminded them of the people she had trusted. She emphasized that Argan had lost the war with Ugal through betrayal. Someone close to her brother, the Emperor, had passed on the tactics to the enemy. She stressed the importance of not ignoring the possibility of a traitor among her own. The servants nodded reservedly and promised to take that fact into account. The butler asked the princess to personally check the report, which was drawn up together with Sober. He believed that this way he could more quickly identify the culprit, proving the innocence of his subordinates. Elizabeth looked at the pile of papers and, not hiding her hesitation, asked herself if the task really fell to her. In the end, she hesitantly agreed. Meanwhile, Irene quickly headed to her chambers, asking her assistant how long the princess had lived in the castle. Miss heard that about a month and a half had passed, and in her opinion, Elizabeth should have been watched more closely. The smile on her face hinted at hidden plans. Against the backdrop of the setting sun, amidst the endless sands of the desert, stood a lone tent. The knights waited inside for the Duke, glancing anxiously outside. One of them suggested with cautious hope that Raguet might have calmed down, but Reuben shook his head, saying that he hadn't yet. Christian stood among the torn bodies of the beasts. His hand, covered in dragon scales, was dripping with blood, and his bright blue eyes were shining with inhuman fury. The cheek was also partially covered with scales. Sir whispered that until the hand returned to human form, it was best not to touch it if he wanted to save his life. In the silence of the castle study, under the shimmering rays of the sun sat the princess. Elizabeth was intently looking through the mountains of papers. She had long since stopped seeing the meaning in the lines and stamps that stretched before her eyes. But her conscience would not allow her to postpone the matter. Sober cautiously reminded her that everything would be referred to the Duke for consideration. But according to the butler, it would be more appropriate if Her Highness took charge of matters herself. The assistant, glaring intently at the princess, remarked that once the Archduke learned about the situation, it would not end well. He had been gloomy and unusually sensitive for a whole week after his return. Alfredo added with a note of alarm that in this state, Christian could break their necks before they could explain anything. Elizabeth, surprised, seemed not ready to believe it, that the man she knew would go to such lengths. But Sober was quick to assure her that things were different with her. It didn't concern her. Miss Pattinson was also convinced that it would be better for Her Highness to deal with the matter herself, to avoid unnecessary casualties. So if the princess agreed, she could write the Duke a short letter explaining. The words about the letter touched Elizabeth. She got down to business, sitting down at her desk. There were several crumpled and rolled sheets of paper lying around, attempts that she didn't like. The writing seemed too friendly, then too cold. She leaned wearily against the table, her fingers gliding slowly over the lines. Her thoughts began to blur. The princess wondered if he would return sooner if he received the letter. A farewell kiss, tender as a testament, flashed through her memory. It seemed to her that the Duke might actually return. Suddenly, a strange voice broke the moment. Zenobia Irene appeared in the room as if out of thin air. With an ironic smile on her lips, she tilted her head, hinting that the letter seemed to be addressed to a man. Turning to leave, the missus remarked with feigned politeness that if the letter was of an official nature, it should be formatted accordingly. Be sure to include the recipient's name and title. She herself always followed this etiquette. And with mocking indulgence she added, even if the princess allowed herself familiarity, that didn't mean that others had to respond in the same tone. After all, it was about the Archduke, her savior, whom she openly acknowledged as such. Those words suddenly opened up a new meaning for Elizabeth. They corresponded, regularly. And everything Irene said about politeness in letters was not about protocol at all, but about personal relationships. Christian's words about how rarely he was called by his name flashed through the princess's memory, and how comfortable he was living in a world where names had no weight. Turning away, Her Highness tried to distance herself from the thought. But something inside her changed. Clenching her fist, she realized she couldn't afford weakness or confusion. Looking at the smug Irene, sitting on the couch with an arrogant look, Elizabeth decided that if she wanted to confront her, she would have to rise to her level. A heavy silence fell in the room. Miss glared at her with her big green eyes and casually remarked that she was looking at her with too much pity. The princess didn't answer. She simply remained silent, unwilling to acknowledge any emotion, ignoring her question. Irene suddenly laughed nervously, defiantly throwing in that Her Highness was pretending to be noble, although she herself in the end sold her body for the sake of survival. In response, there was a dull creak of a chair, and the princess stood up. Her voice was cold and reserved. She expressed her wish that Miss Rotiro would leave as soon as the matter was concluded. Irene suddenly jumped up from the sofa. Approaching, she seemed inflamed with contempt, and grabbed Elizabeth's hand. With irony in her voice, she warned that the princess had thought in vain that she could maintain her pride for long. It seemed to her that she lived with the feeling that the world belonged to her, and she added that the Archduke was said to have taken a fancy to her. Elizabeth looked at her calmly and replied that she wished it were true. Miss, at first surprised by such a confession, quickly regained her superior tone. She emphasized that she, the bearer of a high title, could not be treated in this way. And she stepped even closer, radiating mocking contempt. The princess warned that if she continued to be rude, she would not hesitate to call the guards. Irene, full of curiosity, asked who exactly she was going to call. It seemed that the miss had purposely squeezed her shoulders even tighter, adding with a challenge that if only the princess would try, she would discover all the secrets hidden behind that door. Elizabeth, stunned by the audacity, was silent at first, and then she firmly asked what she had allowed herself to do. Irene, looking at her face, realized that her words had hit the mark. Lightly touching her stomach, she cheekily remarked that she knew about the pregnancy, and quietly asked why Her Highness was still so thin. Elizabeth tried to speak, but Miss wouldn't let her. About 3 months into the pregnancy, there were no noticeable signs. Clutching the princess's hands tighter, Irene pointed out boldly that the situation had aroused suspicion. She added that Regent Christian had taken a liking to the woman, although he had numerous trophies that he could only admire. The princess, stunned, remained silent, pressing her lips together. Irene sneered that even the beggar laughed at that. Suddenly, Her Highness abruptly pulled her hands away and ordered them to be released. She declared that if she had lived her whole life like the high-born woman of Benella, she would be foolish not to understand what was happening. Raising her voice, she reminded him that Irene didn't seem to realize the magnitude of the situation. The lady, smiling, said that the princess was talented in something. Coming closer, she whispered in her ear, "If the princess returns to the castle and tells everything herself, her head will be cut off." At first stunned, Elizabeth quickly pulled herself together and asked what she really wanted. Miss smiled, took a lock of her hair and carefully tucked it behind her ear, saying that she wished Her Highness would stop pretending to be an archduchess. After all, there was a real possibility that the child would be born half-dragon. She laughed out loud, arguing that it was better to have several children. After all, becoming a duchess, she would not have to worry about the birth of heirs alone. With a slight challenge in her voice, she asked if the princess understood her hint. Elizabeth was stunned, unable to hide her inner shock. A few days later, the princess was lying in bed in her chambers. Ives, concerned, noticing her depressed state after the arrival of Miss, asked if everything was okay. Her Highness silently clutched the sheet, remembering Irene's poisonous words, that the castle might know her secret. The lady promised to find out who exactly in a few days, but she could not understand whether the emperor would forgive such accomplices. At that moment, looking at the faithful Ivesa, the princess bowed her head, lost in thought. It seemed to her that the contract should have included a clause about those who knew her secret, but until he decided what to do, he would have to remain humble before Miss Irene. The assistant noted that it had been 8 days since the Duke had left the castle. She thought his return would reassure Her Highness. Elizabeth shuddered slightly and agreed. At times like these, she really wanted to feel him near her. Night had fallen, and the bright moonlight was flooding the room. The princess slept restlessly. The moon seemed to be circling in the sky, and her mind drifted into a reverie. In her dream, she heard a voice. It was her brother. Andrew was calling her, screaming, begging her to run away, to stay as far away as possible. The princess opened her eyes in her sleep and saw his ghostly form. Her brother's face was disfigured. One eye was bandaged and he was emaciated. Hugging his sister, Andrew silently radiated anxiety which broke through his every movement, every word. He reminded them that there could be no true love between a descendant of Gallian and a child of Simisita. His words became a warning. She should leave before her feelings become a trap. She can't let her emotions blur the boundaries of her mind. He also cannot be allowed to touch Her Highness's magic, at least until he himself reappears. Elizabeth woke up, her eyes wide open, her heart pounding. Her lips silently whispered her brother's name. She was aware of everything she felt and at the same time couldn't understand it. Tears quietly rolled down her cheeks, and an inner scream tore at her soul. Elizabeth trembled in confusion, not knowing how to leave or to satisfy her longing. She only wished that he would simply return and she would be consumed by weeping. The silence of the desert night seemed eternal. Christian sat alone by the fire, bent over a letter. The fire cast shadows on his face and the paper trembled in his hands. Sir Reuben approached him cautiously, not breaking the silence. The Duke did not speak at once. There was anxiety in his silence. The letter spoke of the appearance of an uninvited guest in Rotiro, a representative of the Irene family, sent on the direct orders of the emperor. What seemed like a trifle to others aroused alarm in him. Reuben understood everything without words. An indescribable threat hung in the air. The princess wrote that, apparently, the culprit behind the disappearance of the tribute was hiding somewhere in Rotiro, so she would have to do everything she could to find the traitor before he returned. She also expressed hope that the Duke would return soon. What he read stunned Christian. In every line he felt the anxiety that troubled Her Highness. He remembered her request to return as soon as possible. Then the man clearly realized that there was no more time left for his frantic search, and he ordered to set off immediately and told Reuben to bring the horse. At the evening table, Elizabeth and Miss Pattinson were sitting under the clink of dishes, announcing that a message had arrived. His Highness the Archduke left early this morning and would probably arrive at midnight. She added that the princess should not wait for him and could rest in peace. Leaning over, the lady advised her to finish her work early and go to bed, as Her Highness looked exhausted. Irene intervened, confirming that the princess had looked unimportant for the first time that day. With an ironic smile, she hinted that they wouldn't mind a little fun with the princess. She also suggested calling the princess's personal maid if they got bored. Elizabeth clutched her dress tightly in her hands, barely restraining herself, and remained silent. Miss continued to ask about the maid's name. Assuming it could be Evesa and wanting to hear the princess's opinion, Her Highness turned to Pattinson, informing him that she would be spending some time with Irene. When Mrs. wanted to object, Elizabeth turned her head and cautiously asked to be left alone with the guest. Taking the bottle, Miss carefully poured the red wine into Elizabeth's glass. With a slight smile, she hinted, since the princess was not pregnant, she could afford to drink. Turning away, Her Highness discreetly announced that she did not like alcohol. Irene frowned, wondering if she really had a choice. The princess looked at the glass, then reached out to take it. But after a short pause, turning to Irene, I asked her about her words when she wanted her to give birth. Then Elizabeth took the glass and, without waiting, poured the wine on the table, warning her that it would be better not to offer her that again. She explained that while a guest could drink a glass or even a whole case of wine and wake up in a trance, alcohol was deadly to her. Hearing this, the lady thought it was a kind of blackmail, and she suggested changing the subject to something more interesting. She turned to the princess with a personal question about her husband's tenderness, and whether they were together. Her Highness felt uncomfortable and embarrassed by such a question. She stood up from the table and declared that it was none of her business. If Irene had no intention of running to the Emperor with accusations, it was better not to provoke her. After all, she was already patient with her. Miss Underlip looked silently at Elizabeth, who declared with bitter certainty that she should be spoken to according to needs and not otherwise. The cunning Irene, with an ironic smile, did not understand the reason for such words. She assumed that it was all because she could get pregnant and run away without giving birth. Her Highness was stunned. After all, the Miss knew that she was going to run away anyway, and it was shocking that Irene doubted her sanity. After all, she, Princess Argana, who had lost her family, could not imagine her life in Rotiro, and it was impossible to accept that. Even more worrying was the question of whether the Duke would leave things as they were if he found out the truth. Standing as if the ground had slipped from under her feet, she felt confused. The redhead didn't hesitate to ask if she was afraid, to which the princess replied by recalling the Duke's words that had been spoken during the signing of the contract. He said that Her Highness could leave at any moment if she wished. With bitterness in her voice, she added that the Duke had assured her that it did not matter. Elizabeth believed he would keep his promise. Hearing this, Irene's eyes widened in surprise, and then she burst out laughing loudly, not hiding her admiration at how unexpected and interesting everything turned out to be. She admitted that she had never heard anything like that before. Watching the reaction, the princess thought that there really was something between them, and she nervously wrinkled her dress, imagining their possible connection. Irene stepped closer, pointing out that the Duke seemed to treat her in a special way only because of her title of princess. Placing her hand on Elizabeth's shoulder and squeezing it, she added that, if it were not for her position, the Duke might have killed her at the first meeting. Her Highness asked not to disgrace him, noting that for her he was the most merciful person in Benella. The lady sighed ironically, saying that the princess was deeply mistaken. She paused and hinted that she could tell about one trait of Regit Christian. The lady explained that the etymology of the Christian name, to worship, reflected his essence. He obeyed the nobles, he was merciful, and he instilled in them confidence, as if he were ready to give them the whole world. That is exactly how he behaved with both His Majesty and her. At the end, She asked if the princess really believed that things would be different for her. Irene angrily declared that this was how he misled people. Clenching her hands tightly into fists, she spoke in a raised tone. She was indignant at how he dared to mock the half-dragon who sat on the others' heads and blew dust into their eyes. But at the same time, there was something magnetic about his power, something that drew her in. Rotiro, the land to the north, seemed blessed to her, and that was why she wanted at least a fraction of that power, even his name. Turning to the princess, the lady expressed her desire, so that she would give birth to a child and give it to her. Smiling slyly, she looked Elizabeth straight in the eyes and added that then she would send her back to Argan. Her Highness was stunned by what she heard. Irene calmly, almost casually, announced that the Imperial Guard would arrive in the fall, so the princess remained defenseless. Elizabeth remained silent, intently catching every word like a taut string about to snap. Miss continued, listing with cold conviction those who were involved in the princess's escape. The doctor who examined her, the faithful maid who helped her more than anyone else, and several others. All of them, she said, would be executed for deceiving His Majesty. Then, looking up defiantly, she challenged him, claiming that Christian was unlikely to be able to save her. After all, he is unlikely to give up his feudal power for the sake of a woman who has lost value to the empire, like a trophy that has long since faded. Therefore, according to Irene, the princess should have accepted her helping hand. Turning to her, she said, because she had always dreamed of returning home. Bowing her head, Elizabeth hesitated. Doubts wrestled in her soul. She asked why she had suddenly changed her attitude. The lady, after thinking for just a moment, replied that with the arrival of the Archduke, she herself would need support. If she wanted to get out of that place alive, she couldn't do without the princess's help. She reminded him of her offer. And she offered to raise the child the princess was about to give birth to, and help her return home, calling it a good deal. But the princess only looked up firmly and replied that she did not trust her. There was clearly an ulterior motive in Irene's words, and she could feel it. Their conversation was suddenly interrupted by Pattinson, who, entering the room with a creaking door, announced that His Highness the Archduke had arrived. Irene, with a slight sneer, noted that he had arrived before midnight. Rising from her chair, she reminded the princess once again to think carefully about her proposal, urging her not to run to her husband like an obedient puppy, and not to reveal the content of the conversation. Her voice sounded insistent. It was worth wondering if her life was really in danger. With a bang on the door, the miss left Elizabeth alone with her disturbing thoughts. Meanwhile, in the stable, amidst the smell of hay and the steam of tired horses, Reuben was breathing heavily. He was still nauseous from the frantic pace of the journey. He looked as if he was about to vomit. Christian stood nearby, watching him coldly. At that moment, the sound of footsteps came to life in the stable. Then the princess ran. Seeing her faithful horse Chernish, she rushed towards him, and he, recognizing her, clucked his hoof in delight. Elizabeth put her arms around his neck, snuggling against his warm fur, and anxiously asked if he was all right. It seemed to her that he might have been injured on the journey. Seeing the princess near the horse, Christian remarked with a smile that it would be better to share the words with him, and not just with Chernish. Looking at the faithful stallion, the Duke jokingly ordered him to stand back. He said that the evening was already filled with pleasant moments. Then he turned seriously to Elizabeth, asking with concern why she hadn't slept yet and if she was really okay. Her Highness looked away, answering vaguely that she didn't quite understand what he meant. She assured him that everything was fine with her. Her voice trembled and a faint blush covered her cheeks. Christian, gently touching a curl near her face, raised a strand to his nose and inhaled the scent. His gaze became more attentive. He noticed the smell of alcohol. She turned away in embarrassment, denying with too much ardent obstinacy that she had drunk anything. Shame made her remember the people in his office and ask him to leave, adding that after meeting with him she would be able to go to bed in peace. But suddenly, Reget decisively picked her up in his arms. His voice was almost a whisper. He said he would carry her himself. The princess whispered in his ear in surprise that there were too many eyes watching them. But the Duke only calmly replied that they had been seen before. But she meant something completely different. As they walked down the night corridor, Irene suddenly appeared to meet them. She smiled lightly at Christian. Noting that she hadn't seen her knight for a long time, the Duke ironically admitted that he seemed to understand who was drinking alcohol. Miss sighed and added with a bitter tinge in her voice that the Archduke didn't even have the courage to greet her properly. The man respectfully apologized if he seemed unhappy to see her. Irene sensed that there really was something between them. Their communication style was similar, as if they were connected by more than just coincidence. But Christian had no idea what she meant. At that moment, the princess's thoughts returned to that feeling. Perhaps they really were lovers, and the atmosphere around confirmed it. Her Highness doubted it, but she could not ignore such a possibility. Bending down, gracefully fanning herself with her fan, Irene displeasedly confirmed this behavior. After all, she had long known how the Duke felt about her. As he passed her, heading towards the princess's chambers, Christian said quietly that he was glad she seemed to understand everything, and then it seemed he wouldn't have to apologize for his rudeness. Suddenly, Irene added boldly that she and the princess would see each other again tomorrow, and they will have an equally pleasant time. The Duke, with a slight smile, ordered Elizabeth to pay no attention to her words, and he gently asked her to focus on his voice, which sounded from the depths of his loving gaze. Irene watched from afar, her smile hiding secret intentions. Left alone with the princess in her chambers, the Duke calmly inquired whether she had spent too much time with Miss Irene. There was a slight weariness in his voice. When he suggested that her company might have exhausted Elizabeth, she was silent. Her gaze was downcast, her hands nervously clutching the fabric of her dress. Her voice barely escaped from her parched lips. Christian gently apologized that this time everything had taken longer than he had expected, because every situation was unpredictable. He admitted that allowing an outsider to move freely around the castle was reckless on his part, but he assured her that the miss would soon leave the palace, and Her Highness will no longer have to worry. With an effort, Elizabeth uttered what burned inside her. She had heard that there had once been talk of marriage between him and Irene. The Duke had immediately denied it, assuring her that it had been a long time ago. But the princess could not hide her indignation. 3 years is not an eternity at all. He looked away, quietly saying that he remembered almost nothing. There was a silence, thick and tense as before a storm. Then she said, barely audible, that she had heard of the lady's obtrusive nature, and she cautiously noticed whether she might resemble her. Christian answered without hesitation, decisively and calmly. There was nothing in common between them. The man carefully took the princess's foot, trying to remove her shoe. The stunned Elizabeth immediately assured him that she would call Eve. But Rajat calmly replied that he would manage on his own. She insisted that it was time for him to go, and Sober was waiting for him in the office. The Duke calmly recalled that it was Eliza who wanted him to arrive earlier, and when she was convinced of his presence, it seemed that everything ended there. Taking off his shoe, he sighed, as if he had expected such coldness. Christian was in no hurry. Her Highness's behavior was simply repulsive. The princess was embarrassed. He bent down and kissed her foot. She shuddered, feeling how much feeling was hidden in that gesture and how important it was to him. Looking closely at her face, Christian noticed that she did not look well. The Duke insisted on calling a doctor, but the princess suddenly interrupted his concern, confessing that she was simply sad. Without holding back any longer, she threw herself into his arms. Tears welled up in her eyes. She whispered that she wanted to go with him next time, not wanting to stay in the palace alone. He held her silently, letting her tremble in the warm silence of his embrace. Finally, he said softly that he would do it next time. They sat for a long time, silently enveloped in silence like two shores that, after a long separation, touched each other again with a stream of feelings. After changing his clothes, Rajat returned to his office. In the semi-darkness, he stood by the window, gazing thoughtfully at the night landscape, allowing his thoughts to consume him. The silence was broken by the click of the doorknob, followed by the familiar voice of Irene. She politely asked if he would find a moment for her, because, she said, she would hardly be able to fall asleep after such a warm greeting. Soon they were sitting across from each other, each with a cup of tea in hand. Christian watched her silently, letting the memories surface. Pattinson's words from earlier echoed in her head. It seemed to her that Irene had revealed Her Highness's secret, the one that Elizabeth hid even from him. She is not pregnant. That news was shocking. And even more so the look of the princess after meeting with Irene. The woman suspected that the miss had somehow learned the truth, and she did not hesitate to use that knowledge against her. Christian watched silently as Irene sat before him, her expression impassive. A silence like a blade matured within him. If he had destroyed her right then, it would have reached Eliza. But that denouement could not wait. She should have been dealt with earlier, quietly. Finally. The lady's gaze was piercing, like a blade sliding along nerves. She broke the silence with a cold smile, assuming that he might have been contemplating murder, that the Duke might have been planning to eliminate someone in the castle while his Duchess slept peacefully. Her voice was soft, almost indifferent, but there was a venomous undertone to every word. Christian maintained his composure. However, he made it clear that he was tired of her constant attacks on Elizabeth. He would prefer that she didn't do it. But Irene, without losing her cheeky smile, asked mockingly, had they really decided to play married? She thought it was funny. In her mind, she was complaining about the crazy princess, who, in her opinion, had a distorted view of reality. But suddenly she noticed Christian's gaze. There was something wild and dangerous about him, like a predator about to pounce. His eyes screamed for one thing. At that moment he was ready to tear her apart. Clutching her cup as if trying to keep her balance, the lady warned quietly, but with tension in her voice, that the Duke should be more careful. But the man didn't understand what she meant. Then she leaned a little closer and said boldly that he seemed dangerously interested in the woman. And Her Highness didn't seem to even suspect that. Irene, with a barely perceptible calm in her voice, emphasized that the princess was just looking for a way to escape. He probably didn't believe she would stay in Rotiro forever. Christian asked if Her Highness had told Irene anything. The lady, looking at him from under her brow, replied with a slight intrigue that she might have. Then he asked if the miss wondered why he was still staring at her. She, unexpectedly for herself, replied that it was all because of the events of 3 years ago. The man said that he had kept silent for the sake of her honor, granting her leniency, because he understood how difficult it was for her because of what had happened. He openly admitted that if it weren't for that incident, he would have lost her presence long ago. But the truth deeply affected Irene. Memories of that day came flooding back to her mind. She had walked through the garden with Christian, asking him if he thought she was the most beautiful woman in Benalla. He confirmed that without a doubt. And then, when she asked about other women, he just quietly replied that he hadn't seen a better one. The lady doubted the sincerity of his words, but his look and silence convinced her otherwise. Then she remembered the scream and the terrible events. As she sat in the living room, wounded and bandaged, in her nightgown and cloak, Pattinson warned her not to approach the Archduke. In those days when he was in a state of frenzy. After all, then it was not a romantic desire that awakened in him, but a thirst for murder. Those memories shocked Irene to the core. She asked herself and Christian, was she crazy to him then? However, she immediately firmly declared that she did not care. The lady still longed for that place called Rotiro, and wanted to see the Duke by her side. The man, however, firmly assured her that she had been living in a world of illusions until now. Miss stood up and declared with a cold challenge in her voice that she only wanted to see how he would spend his life alone. Turning around, she announced that she would be the first to go out that evening to get some fresh air, and she wished Christian good night. The door closed softly behind her. She sighed deeply, feeling a heavy weight on her soul, and she remembered his strict order not to do any more rash things. If she alarmed the half-dragon, everything would have fatal consequences for both of them. In her heart, Irene wondered if he was truly capable of love. After all, he wasn't even human. No one could ever love Roger Christian. But in her eyes, anger and an irresistible thirst for revenge burned, and she firmly promised to do everything she could to make it happen. The moonlight gently penetrated through the large windows of the princess's bedroom, illuminating the notes with magic circles and crumpled pieces of paper scattered on the table. The Duke quietly entered the room. Eliza was fast asleep, her face wrinkled from the nightmare. In her sleep, she called out to André, missed him, and begged him to take her away. Rigette quietly addressed her, asking her to look at him. But she did not hear his words and only muttered something under her breath. When he reached out to touch, Her Highness was suddenly illuminated by some inner light. Her eyes opened and she was surprised to see Roger standing before her. He leaned closer and quietly asked who she was looking for in that dream. Sitting down, the man asked her the same question again. Speaking sleepily, she replied that she had said she wanted him. Christian squeezed her shoulders tightly, but the princess said it hurt. At first he didn't hear, but when she repeated it again, he let her go and apologized. Lying down next to her, he placed his hand on her face. He was thinking about all the attempts to calm her down. Suddenly she placed her hand on his chest, and she quietly leaned her head on his shoulder, which made the Duke shudder. Asking gently who had visited her in her dream, whether it was the Emperor of Argan, he felt Elizabeth pull him close and softly say, "Sometimes." Her eyes barely opened. Christian was silent, but he reached out to touch her head again. and it shone with a gentle blue light again. No matter how hard the Duke tried, it was impossible to get rid of him. The twins' world remained intact, surrounded by a solid wall of secrecy. Hovering over her, he began to embrace her tenderly, barely touching her lips with his finger. Suddenly, he realized that he had sought to destroy that fragile world. The marks engraved on her fragile body were so deep that even the power of a dragon could not erase them. Powerful fingers gently caressed her face, slowly descending to her neck, which he began to kiss. He decided that he would not leave them, but leave his own traces. Hovering over her height, Regé tenderly embraced and kissed her, plunging into the depths of their unchanging bond. The night dragged on too long. The Duke got out of bed and exhaled heavily, silently admitting his madness. True madness. Even if he managed to go through all the trials, he didn't want a child like him to be born. Standing in the princess's bedroom, the man stared at the sleeping Elizabeth. He also couldn't shake the thought that Emperor Argana might be alive, and if she finds out, Christian will lose his power over her, and he won't be able to keep her in chains anymore. Penetrating into the depths of her sleep, he spoke softly. That, judging by the direction of her thoughts, Her Highness had completely taken possession of his heart. The princess was sound asleep. Rising from the bed, the Duke quietly approached the table, where numerous notes lay. He paused for a moment to glance at one of the sheets. There was a magic circle depicted there. Doubt filled him. He whispered quietly to himself that it must be a real magic symbol. Far to the southeast of the Grandel continent, amidst the light pouring from every window, stood the castle of Riosa, the majestic addition to the regal royal family. It rose among the luxurious gardens that surrounded it, like a living amulet. A man in a cloak with a wide hood that hid his face was walking up the steep stone steps. When he reached the door, he announced that the king and Prince Regal had safely set out on their journey. His interlocutor reminded him that he was the one who was supposed to accompany them. The man threw off his hood. He was gray-haired and in his 20s, the Duke of the Argan Empire. His name was Fabian Bellator. He reassured her that the king had repeatedly ordered her not to worry and to focus on her recovery. Therefore, there was no reason for concern. His Majesty Andrew had heard rumors that Kondrat had followed the princess to the Teni River, and the Duke insisted not to worry. They were trying to find a way to let Her Highness know that he was alive. André thought that the Archduke was really trying to erase the magic circle. After all, their bond is strong, like iron, and it's not so easy to break. He deliberately drew circles that are hard to notice. But the Emperor frowned and remarked, if that were the case, it was unlikely that Eliza would be safe. At the same time, he felt that Master Rotiro had treated her well. At least he wasn't being cruel or forceful. He could feel her calling, that deep down she only wanted him back. André understood that without him she would not have trusted him so much. Fabian noted that Princess Argana would not give her heart to the enemy just like that. And her consent to that senseless marriage had good reasons. The Lord, looking at him, explained that he had ordered Eliza to survive at all costs, and that was the only path she could choose. Stepping back from the table, he added that Princess Argana's true place was not in Rotiro, and after the Duke's death, she will inherit Argan and become the only witch on the continent of Grandel. That is why she must be taken out of there at all costs. During breakfast, the princess asked if Riget was angry with her. The Duke, without looking up from his documents, assured her that he could not have been angry. Her Highness remained in the dark as to why he thought so. Exhaling heavily, he reached his hand to her forehead and felt that the temperature had not yet subsided. Approaching her, he reported that when he came to her, she was so depressed that she could barely regain consciousness. The princess, blushing with shame, admitted that this happened often, especially during her stay in Argan. The man said that he was the only one who managed to improve her condition a little, but later she got sick again, which made him angry. But Christian never blamed her for it. Her Highness, sitting in bed with breakfast, apologized and admitted that she should have taken more care of her health. The Duke assured her that he did not want to hear an apology. Looking at him with wide eyes, the princess noticed something. That every time he asked her not to apologize with that expression on his face, she wondered how he managed to catch the culprit who took the tribute. But the man replied that he had not even begun to do so. Eliza was surprised. It had been 4 days since his arrival. Christian admitted that he was upset by her condition and didn't quite understand the question. After all, she didn't seem to be fully aware of what she wanted. Annoyed, the princess pushed her plate away and refused to eat. The man took a fork and began to feed her, strictly ordering him not to leave the bedroom until he finished eating. She, looking at him with her forehead, whispered that he really did resemble Andri. Then Regette remarked that the Emperor of Argana had treated her in the same way. She confirmed that the boy was no less persistent. And the longest he didn't let her go out was a whole month, and she asked if the Duke would like to do the same. Her husband had sternly warned her not to mention him in his presence. The subject clearly irritated Christian greatly. The princess remembered at that moment that he was from Benella, and was the commander-in-chief of the enemy knights, and in her naivety she thought that he was on her side. She put her hand to her chest and felt his words, that if she didn't eat all the food she wouldn't be able to make it through the night. Her Highness did not understand the meaning of such restraint, but her husband explained that this was exactly what she had been striving for with all confidence. Taking her hand, Regette kissed her passionately. His rapt gaze and voice indicated the need to overcome that ordeal. The princess walked through the wide corridors of the castle, holding her stomach tightly, and Eve walking beside her. She remembered his words. If she eats all the food, she can last the night longer. No matter how much she refuses, no matter how much she says she doesn't like something, it will all be in vain. Looking down, the princess thought that this night would be a real test, but her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. With a slight smile and graceful gait, Irene, dressed in a luxurious cherry-colored dress, walked toward her, as if she had just stepped out of the pages of an aristocratic portrait. Miss, with carefree politeness, remarked that they had not seen the princess for quite some time, and she wanted to talk. Soon the two young ladies were sitting opposite each other in a bright, sunlit living room, and the aroma of freshly brewed tea was in the air. The conversation began with the princess. Calmly, but with a hint of curiosity in her voice, she remarked that she had heard the lady intend to return that evening. Irene, smiling and laughing a little, confessed that she thought if she stayed even a little longer, her husband would tear her head off. She hinted that since they were alone, it would be worth finding out if the princess liked her proposal. Her Highness placed the cup on the table, and gathering her thoughts, firmly stated that in order to give a clear answer, she needed to clarify something important. Elizabeth frankly admitted that she did not trust Miss. She doubted whether she would send her to Argan if she gave birth. And why take such a risk at all? Especially considering Irene's open hostility towards the Archduke and the princess herself. It seemed to her that she only wanted to take over the territory of Rotiro, and Regette's favor was for her a way to avoid the imperial whims. Knowing this, Elizabeth could not imagine how she could trust her child to her. The lady, smiling, denied all the accusations. He said that it was absurd for the princess to think that way, because it was she who gave her a chance to survive. It didn't matter to her who would raise the child or how. Her Highness firmly stated that if Irene dared to take such a step, she would have to take care of all the consequences until the very end. She added that if the baby was born, she would stay in Rotiro longer. And then, pressing her hand to her chest, she confessed that the return to Argan is not yet lost. The irritated Miss mockingly asked her if she really didn't understand anything. She noted that at least she could somehow explain the marriage to the commander-in-chief of an enemy country. After all, the princess found herself in a difficult situation. Irene ironically remarked that after the birth she was going to leave, doubting whether the princess was really so righteous or naive, or whether she really loved him. Elizabeth silently thought about how their relationship, built on mutual benefit, had taken on a certain meaning. She realized that from the moment she took his hand, their future seemed to be sealed, and she knew the truth. Her feelings, her actions, and her consequences contradicted each other. Irene objected to her vehemently, insisting that true love between them was impossible, and that her Highness was crazy if she thought otherwise. She laughed with contempt at the fact that Eliza had fallen in love, and even more ironically, she noted that she wanted the blessing of the most beautiful woman in Grandel. She boldly suggested that the princess was going to raise the child and leave Rotiro. After all, Argana would not exist by then. Elizabeth involuntarily shuddered at what she heard. Trying to say something, she didn't even have time to open her mouth. The lady, with a sly smile, added a few more words that struck right to the heart. The princess was seized by a merciless shock. The cold, then the heat came in waves, making her whole body tremble. She became mute, unable to utter a single sound. She only painfully longed to hear again what had poisoned her soul then. But the lady did not cease to astonish her Highness with news. With a slight smile and a cold look in her eyes, Irene threw the last cruel jab. It's hard to believe, but what if she hears it from her husband's lips? When evening came, the moonlight gently illuminated the Duke's palace. He stood on the balcony, dressed in armor, covered in blood. Irene, not hiding her surprise, quietly asked, was it really necessary to kill a person just because they were trying to justify themselves? And was this a common occurrence for a half-dragon? She was amazed to see how neatly the head had been severed. The Duke turned to sober. The assistant reported that all the events were carefully documented, and he approached Irene, handing her a letter with all the details, so that she could deliver them to His Majesty. Turning her head, the lady looked closely at the bloodied Regent, and with bitter irony she noted that apparently it was with that sword that he committed more than one murder among Argan's soldiers. She was filled with astonishment. How could such a beautiful Princess Argana choose such a man as her companion? Christian gripped his sword tightly in anger, but the miss did not relent. She persistently provoked him, hinting at danger. With an urgency in her voice, Irene rebuked him, not finding her words. Did he really intend to take her away from the world again? Without losing her audacity, she continued. If only he would stop for a moment before doing something like that right within the walls of his own palace. The Duke coldly corrected her that one could only regret something after it had been done. Smiling ironically, she suggested changing the subject. She cautiously noted that according to rumors, Argan's troops were concentrated in Regal. That phrase struck Christian, as if he had turned to stone, frozen for a moment with surprise. With cold certainty in her voice, Irene calmly continued. There was a hint in her words. It was possible that the Duke did not dare reveal the truth to the princess. The bodies of Telebelathur and Duke Conrad were never found, and their disappearance only increased suspicion that the Emperor of Argana might be alive. The lady's words sank into Christian's mind like a sharp blade, leaving him no time to recover. She continued to ask. With cold certainty, she said that the truth would certainly upset Her Highness, and he would not be able to let her go after that. Christian clenched his jaw as if trying to quell the storm within him. But Irene didn't stop, her gaze piercing and her words precise, like blows to the living. She directly stated whether the princess knew who she was dealing with. At that moment, Elizabeth stood behind her like a shadow. Her Highness heard every word. The man finally spoke up. He tried to resist uttering a short phrase. What would change when she found out? But Irene only slightly shrugged, unable to suppress a sly smile, and delivered the last most accurate blow. That Eliza knew the truth, and nothing could sway her to a different decision. The Duke froze. It seemed that even the air around him froze with him.